In a recent video, we provided a brief overview of the regions and history of the Slice, the heartland of the Republic. Lying between the Polemian trade route and the Corellian run, the Slice was the core of galactic civilization, hugely important to the history and culture of the Star Wars galaxy. It was also very big. So big, in fact, that we had to gloss over a whole lot about the region in our previous video on it. Today, we'll be showing precisely none of that restraint. We're going to be going on a complete tour of the Slice today, discussing all the major trade routes that pass through it, its sectors and significant worlds, and the civilizations that defined it. We'll also be paying special attention to how the Slice was split during the Clone Wars and how the conflict affected the region. Strap in and get ready for a whirlwind tour of the Republic's heartland.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we begin, let's establish the ground rules for our tour of the Slice. We're not going to mention every single system in the Slice by name, though our scriptwriter made a complete list for some of these regions during the making of this video, so if that's something you're interested in, let us know and we'll get you sorted. We will, however, be at least mentioning all of the interesting systems. Apart from discussing the planets and sectors of the Slice, we'll also be covering trade routes, the relationships various Slice civilizations had with one another, and also how the different regions of the Slice fared during the Clone Wars. Finally, for the sake of simplicity, we're going to be dividing the Slice up according to the galaxy's standard region model, beginning with the Slice portion of the Colonies and ending with the Slice portion of the Outer Rim. Starting off, let's look at the Colonies, the innermost region of the Slice and the first part of it to be settled. Settlement of the Colonies began in the pre-Republic era, as the sleeper ship colonies humanity established in the core worlds became independent societies and sent out sleeper ships of their own. This was how the region got its name. Once, the known worlds of the Colonies region were almost all colonies of the core worlds, but these worlds didn't stay colonies for long, since multi-planetary empires didn't last long in the age before the hyperdrive. By the time the Republic was founded, many of the colonies were already independent, and the rest would soon follow. After the invention of the hyperdrive and the formation of the Republic, the rest of the colonies region was explored very quickly. By the start of the Chinese War, just 1,000 years after the founding of the Republic, the whole Slice portion of the colonies had been explored. By the time of the Clone Wars, the whole region had been charted and settled for tens of thousands of years, and the colonies were second only to the core worlds in terms of wealth, political power, and prestige, especially those within the Slice. The colonies prided themselves on being the economic engine of the galaxy. The region had both extensive reserves of capital, like the core worlds, and plenty of highly productive systems, like the Inner Rim, and it made the best of both. Before we get into an overview of the colonies themselves, let's quickly cover the major hyperspace routes that pass through this region. As for every part of the Slice, this portion of the colonies was bordered by the Polemian trade route and the Corellian run. A third super hyper route, the Hydian Way, cut through the colonies near the Corellian run. The space between was knit together by a vast web of smaller routes, providing access to every inch of space in the colonies. Of these, there were 4 important ones. The Commodore run and the Trellan trade route both connected the colonies to the core worlds, with the former ending at Commodore and the latter passing Commodore on its way to the Inner Rim. The Quelor run ran between Commodore and Quelor, while the Nanthri route passed Quelor on its way from Exodine to the Inner Rim and beyond. Let's start by looking at the worlds of the Polemian trade route. The Polemian passed through a fairly diverse group of important systems in the colonies, beginning with the Del system, which contained some of the colony's most productive agricultural worlds, the chief of which was Del 2. After Del 2, the route passed Yabul Opa, home to the prestigious planet-spanning university of Yabul Opa, and the stormy trade world of Ifmix 6, the homeworld of the Squalris, a species renowned for their canny merchants. Schulstein 5, the next stop on the route, was an infamous shadow port, a haven for smugglers and all manner of underworld types, while Castel was the homeworld of the Gossam, a species of wrinkly reptilians known for their shrewdness and business-mindedness. The Gossam are the first alien civilization we're going to be looking at with higher than usual influence in their region of space. Castel was a heavily urbanized industrial world, a regional economic titan, and the Gossam had been a spacefaring people since before the Republic, having long ago colonized Felucia using the primitive and highly dangerous Tumble hyperdrive. The Gossam had been one of the most influential alien species in the Republic for millennia, but by the Republic's final centuries, they had fallen on hard times and Castel was plunged into a decades-long recession. This led to the whole planet being bought up by the Commerce Guild, which subjected the Gossam to high rent and indentured servitude in exchange for being brought out of recession. When the Gossam Shu Mei became Presidente of the Commerce Guild, she was able to buy back her homeworld, only to turn around and raise the rent on her people, demanding they give her tribute in gratitude for making Castel independent again. Moving on, the last Colonies world the Polemian passed on its way to the Inner Rim was Rythal, an ice ball with only one location of note on its surface, the Rythal Academy, one of the most prestigious military academies in the galaxy. The Rythal Academy trained ground troops for the Republic Army during the Old Republic era, and after the Republic Army ceased to exist, it started training infantry for the Planetary Security Forces and the Judicial Forces instead. Not far from Rythal was the site of another of the galaxy's foremost military academies, Karida, the home of the Academy of Karida. Karida was largely an agri-world, but a very rugged one with higher than average gravity, which made it ideal for training elite infantry. The Karida Academy, which its cadets nicknamed Cliffside due to its position atop a sheer cliff, was the most famous for training stormtroopers during the time of the Empire, but it still trained some of the galaxy's best under the Republic, training elite troopers and army officers for the Judicials and the PSFs alike. There were a handful of notable worlds in the vicinity of Karida, in the northern part of the Colonies. There was the old Grand Colony of Hock, known for its crystal mines, Dranost and Shelkonwa, both regional trade worlds, Ranklage, the site of an Incom Corporation starfighter factory, and Dakshi, a frequent source of unrest against the galactic government. Close to the Polemian was Belnar, the capital of the Belnar sector, a small territory ruled by the Kill, one of the Republic's earliest non-human member species. The Kill were highly industrious, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to the Republic. They welcomed outsiders on their homeworld of Belnar, but they were nonetheless fierce in defending their territory against anything they perceived as a threat. The Kill had many former colonies in the Belnar sector and its surrounding space, forming a core part of the northern colonies. Further south, the Commodore Run entered the region from the core, passing the beautiful ocean world Katada and Uquine, the site of the climactic final defeat of the pious Dea Crusaders at the hands of the Jedi and their allies. Nearby were the planets Vertseth, home to the droid-making firm Vertseth Automata, Resht 7, the headquarters of the Salaktori Hunters Guild, and Beron, the site of a high-security Republic detention center. Just south of the Commodore Run was the Trellin trade route, which also entered the region from the core, passing two very important worlds, Balmorra and Nemoidia. Balmorra was one of the Republic's most important factory worlds, and it had been since the Republic's founding. For tens of thousands of years, its metal-rich crust had been mined for ore that was hauled straight to Balmorra's factory zones, where they were turned into combat droids and weapons. By the time of the Clone Wars, Balmorra was still the galaxy's #1 arms manufacturer, making it quite wealthy, though you wouldn't be able to tell from its polluted, junk-strewn surface. Balmorra, together with the nearby mech world Foundry, was a member of the Techno Union during the Clone Wars, and both Balmorra and Foundry built large numbers of battle droids for the CIS during the conflict. Balmorra ended up playing both sides, selling battle droids to the Republic in limited quantities as well. On the other hand, Foundry, which housed one of Wat Tambor's private estates, was a strictly separatist world. Nemoidia, meanwhile, was the homeworld of the Nemoidians. Originally a Duros colony founded before the invention of the hyperdrive, The Nemoidians diverged considerably from their relatives on Duro over millennia of isolation, eventually becoming a completely different species. The Nemoidians were one of the most powerful species in the Republic and had been for tens of thousands of years, known for their singular greed as well as for their cowardice. Most Nemoidians had as little to do with their species' homeworld as possible, however. Pure Nemoidia, as it was called to distinguish it from the Nemoidian purse worlds, was an unpleasant, overbearingly humid, high-gravity world. All Nemoidians began life in the planet's grub hatcheries, but most moved to another planet as soon as possible, with only the Nemoidians' unfortunates, their hive mothers, and their political leaders staying home on Nemoidia. Despite this, Nemoidia was still an incredibly important world, as its trade monarch and inner council ruled over all the Nemoidians' colonies and the planetary capital, Koto Sai. As its trade monarch and inner council ruled over all the Nemoidians' colonies. And the planetary capital, Koto Sai, housed the headquarters of many powerful corporations, among them the Trade Federation. Nemoidia, Balmorra, and the core world Kuat were located extremely close to one another in a string along the Trellin trade route. This led to complications during the Clone Wars, in which Nemoidia and Kuat were strongholds for opposing sides. The two worlds spread so many hyperspace mines between their respective territories during the war that it caused problems for hyperspace travel all throughout the region. The Trellin trade route and Comenor Run met at Comenor, one of the galaxy's busiest trade worlds. Comenor, like Balmorra, was established as a colony of Humbarine, but it had long ago achieved independence and set off on its own path. Comenor controlled trade across all the Slice, acting as a gateway for traders traveling between the Slice and the core worlds. As a result, Comenor was as wealthy, populous, and influential as any core world, not to mention immensely strategically important. From Comenor, the Quelor Run struck off south, passing through Nemoidian space, the core Nemoidian territories. While the Nemoidians control the region of space around Nemoidia itself, the bulk of their territories were instead located on the other side of Comenor in an enclave containing dozens of Nemoidian colonies. Most Nemoidians in the galaxy lived on one of these colonies, which were divided up into subsectors, each governed by one of the Nemoidian purse worlds. The purse worlds were the first Nemoidian colonies which had established and ruled over colonies of their own. These had names ending with Nemoidia, and they were also by far the wealthiest Nemoidian worlds, true to their names. 3 of these planets were known by name: Deco-Nemoidia, Coro-Nemoidia, and Cato-Nemoidia. Each of the purse worlds was covered by vaults and grand fortresses built to hoard their owners' treasures, as exemplified by Newt Gunray's citadel on Cato-Nemoidia. Cato-Nemoidia was the wealthiest and most prestigious of all, and only the richest Nemoidians were allowed to live in its grand bridge cities and remote country palaces. Cato-Nemoidia was also the prettiest of the Nemoidian worlds, known for its stunning cliffs and beautiful forests. Past Nemoidian space, the Quelor Run ran to Quelor, an urbanized trade world on the Nanthri route, which headed out to the Inner Rim. Coreward of Quelor, the Nanthri route led back to Exodine, the homeworld of the 6-armed, 6-legged Exodinians. Exodine was located on the Hydian Way, which briefly cut through the colonies on its way to the Inner Rim. Other notable colonies worlds on or in the vicinity of the Hydian were the shipyard planet Vangevalis, Budoles, a world home to extensive archives, the agri-world Herzob, the industrialized grand colony Konsea, headquarters of Konsea Manufacturing, which designed and produced the Y-Wing, Gra Ploven, homeworld of the Ploven, the major Duros colony Aquilae, and Tholoth, the homeworld of the near-human Tholothians. Finally, we come to the worlds of the Corellian Run. For reasons we hope should be obvious, many of the worlds along the inner Corellian Run began as Corellian colonies, with Byblos, Loronar, and the worlds of the Pencal system being prominent examples. The Pencal system contained a string of economically powerful urban worlds, chiefly Pencal 4, while Loronar was a major shipyard world and the headquarters of the Loronar Corporation, which produced military hardware among many other things. Byblos, meanwhile, was another of the wealthiest and most important worlds in the colony. Like Comenor, It was a core world in all but location. It was a vibrant trade world with a thriving starport, also boasting shipyards home to the corporation Byblos Drive Yards. From the earliest days of the Republic, Byblos was a hub of innovation, responsible for countless technological advances over the years. Many corporations had prominent branches there, chief among which was Blast Tech Industries, which was founded on Byblos during the Old Republic era. Almost the entirety of the Colonies region was located within Loyalist space during the Clone Wars, with only a few separatist enclaves scattered around the region. The Grand Army of the Republic divided the Slice colonies between 3 of its reserve sector armies, all based out of headquarters located in the core. The 3rd Sector Army, or Steel Blade Command, garrisoned the Polemian-run worlds, maintaining strongholds on Karita and Rythal, whose academies were given over to the GAR's use. The 2nd Sector Army, or Green Mantle Command, patrolled the colonies south of the Trellin trade route, making use of the shipyards of Lorinar and guarding the Corellian Run and Hydian Way. The region between these two oversectors was the territory of the 4th Sector Army, White Kurace Command, which maintained Comenor as a Republic stronghold, protecting the colony's most important hyperspace crossroads. These sector armies' primary duties were to blockade the separatist enclaves in the colonies, of which there were 3. The 3rd Army blockaded Castel on the Polemian trade route, which seceded from the Republic when the Commerce Guild threw its lot in with the Confederacy, while the 2nd Army blockaded Nemoidian space, where the Trade Federation had vast reserves of wealth and hordes of battle droids. The 4th Army had the toughest challenge, blockading Nemoidia, Balmorra, and Foundry, some of the Confederacy's best defended coreward strongholds. These enclaves still contributed to the war effort somewhat, however. Castor was still able to provide the CIS with Gossam commandos, Balmorra and Foundry cranked out whole armies of battle droids, and the Nemoidian worlds provided conscripted irregulars, elite gunnery battalions, and lots of funding to the CIS military throughout the war. There were a handful of battles in these enclaves during the Clone Wars, but for the most part, it wasn't until the last year of the war that things got serious in the colonies. Beginning in 20 BBY and continuing into 19 BBY, the Republic began a major offensive in the core and colonies aimed at clearing out these separatist enclaves, which ran in parallel with the Outer Rim sieges. Balmorra fell and Nemoidia followed, and Foundry presumably fell too. Separatist forces launched some counterattacks, fighting a notable battle at Comenor, but the Republic contained this offensive and pressed on. In 19 BBY, Castel was captured and Nemoidian space came under siege, the last redoubt the Confederacy had in the core and colonies. One by one, the Nemoidian colonies and then the Purse worlds all fell. Cata Nemoidia lasted the longest, putting up a fierce defense, but by the end of the Clone Wars, it, too, was under Loyalist control. Next up, we have the Inner Rim, the Republic's original frontier. Most of the Inner Rim portion of the Slice, which was just called the Rim at the time, was fully explored by the end of the Republic's expansionist period, and thus, most of the region had been settled for over 20,000 years by the time of the Clone Wars. The rest of the Inner Rim Slice was explored by 15,000 BBY, though the outer reaches of it remained poorly charted and weren't fully settled until around 5,000 BBY. By the time of the Clone Wars, this region was thoroughly developed, crossed by a number of major hyperspace routes, and dotted with industrial worlds and noteworthy civilizations. Apart from the Polemian trade route and the Corellian Run, a few major hyperspace routes ran through the Slice portion of the Inner Rim. The Nanthri route cut through the Inner Rim on its way from the colonies to the Mid-Rim, close to the region's narrowest point, while further north, 3 popular routes converged at Zeltros. The Trellin trade route served as the main route between the Inner Rim and the core, while the Lesser Lantillian route and the Great Kashyyyk branch both struck out into the Rim. Many lesser hyperspace routes wound their way between these major ones, as this part of the Inner Rim was one of the most well-charted parts of the galaxy, with virtually no unexplored systems. As with the colonies, we're going to start at the Polemian trade route. The Polemian passed through 3 known sectors, and likely more. In the Inner Rim, the Darlon sector, the Oros sector, and the Zemacht cluster. Several worlds along this leg of the Polemian played essential roles in galactic society, most notably Tanab, one of the oldest and most productive agricultural worlds in the entire galaxy. This warm, pleasant world was settled at the dawn of the Republic, and virtually the entire planet was given over to agriculture. Tanab's exports kept the core worlds fed, and they had been doing so for 25,000 years. Other important planets on this leg of the Plemian included Tirahan and Chaswa, both of them important trade worlds. Tirahan, located in the Zemacht cluster, was known for its 9 moons, its beautiful countryside, and, above all, its bustling markets. Tirahan was ruled by a mercantile oligarchy, and their capital hosted the Great Fair, one of the largest open-air markets in the galaxy. Chaswa, meanwhile, was an important shipping hub in the Oris sector, if one that smugglers made regular use of. Chaswa was also the site of a number of battles over the course of galactic history, including during the Great Sith War and the Jedi Civil War. Other noteworthy Inner Rim worlds on or near the Plemian included Verdon Ka, an idyllic moss-covered planet home to the peaceful Vovrians, and Mantessa in the Oris sector, a planet of treacherous jungles and dangerous predators. All told, as in other parts of the slice, the Plemian worlds were ancient, wealthy, and very prominent in the history of the Republic. Between the Plemian and the Trellin trade route, there were mainly 2 corridors of settled worlds. One coreward, which was ancient, and one rimward, which was settled much later. The coreward strip contained the Adari, Neshig, Zarik, and Almakar sectors, as well as the Tilak regions, an allied region of the Republic, and the highly dangerous Marasa Nebula, which the Trellin trade route was routed around. The rimward strip contained the Hapes cluster, the territory of the Hapes Consortium, as well as the Alon and Japrael sectors. Several intelligent species called this part of the galaxy home. Among them were the Cloperians of Clopa, a bizarre species of tentacled beings known for their excellent mechanics, the similarly bizarre-looking and slow-moving Berites of Beri, the Stockley of Manres, known for their hunters, the Glassferans of Glassfera, the Amarans of Amar, the Deltrons of Deltron, the Marasans of Marasai, whose cybernetic implants allow them to navigate the dangerous Marasa Nebula, the Colicoids of Colla 4, who, together with the Zeltrons and peoples of the Tilak regions, we'll discuss in more depth in a bit, and the Adari, who lived on Adari but were believed by some archaeologists to have originated elsewhere. Most of these people integrated into the Republic long before the Clone Wars, and some were even involved with the main reason this part of space was as densely populated as it was: industry. This part of the Inner Rim was home to a considerable part of the Republic's industrial base, and entire planets here were completely automated. The Republic had shipyards at Rastarus on the Trellin trade route and at Regovia, with the former of these belonging to a Kuat Driveyard subsidiary. But the export this region was most known for was droids. The barren moon Telti, located in the Sistoine system, was a famous corporate-owned mech world that produced a sizable chunk of the galaxy's droids. A majority of all droids, in fact, were manufactured either on Telti or on Mechas 3, which was located elsewhere in the Inner Rim. Other noteworthy mech worlds included Tala 9 and M478, both of which were completely automated droid colonies. Many of these mech worlds processed raw materials from the mining worlds to the east, such as the volcanic planet Haridon and the planets of Stennis Node. Of course, there was also Colla 4, the home of the Colicoid creation nest. As you probably know, Colla 4's native Colicoids were the designers and manufacturers of the infamous Droidica, as well as the Droid Trifighter, the Scorpionic Annihilator Droid, and the Buzz Droid. Colla 4 wasn't a mech world per se, since there was still plenty of open country there, but the planet's economy was nonetheless built on droid making. The fearsome Colicoids controlled a small swath of space around their homeworld, which they fiercely protected from outsiders. The only outsiders they tolerated were those looking to buy their droids, and even then, these cannibalistic insectoids had a tendency to only agree to a sale in exchange for barge loads of exotic raw meat. Of course, industry wasn't all there was to the northern Inner Rim. You also had Herath, once home to a Jedi enclave, and Dart SX-4, the headquarters of the all-female Renless Bounty Hunters Guild. There were also a number of planets famed for their pirate bands, among them Mercen, Laurel, and Norulak. The Jedi regularly battled the pirates of all three systems, and though they eventually wiped out the Laurel raiders, the Mercen pirates and the pirates of Norulak continued to plague the region well into the time of the Empire. There were also the Tilak regions, which we mentioned earlier. The Tilak regions were an allied region, which meant that they weren't part of the Republic, but on good terms with it. The Tilak regions contained 192 systems divided evenly between three species: the Tilaks of Til, the Tokoyans of Tokoya, and the Murachon of Nasu Mana. The three species had a common culture and religion, according to which they all complemented each other, together making up a perfect whole. They considered the rest of the galaxy to be unholy and rarely ventured beyond the borders of their territory. Members of these three species that rejected these religious beliefs were typically banished from the sector. Most of the Tilak regions were closed to outsiders, with the exception of three planets: Vob, Tunwala, and Daedalon. The Trellin trade route formed the southern border of the northern inner rim, and as we mentioned earlier, it terminated at the planet Zeltros, the home of the Zeltrons. We've done a video about the Zeltrons before, but if you haven't seen it, they were a species of red-skinned humanoids who were intensely empathetic and renowned across the galaxy for their love of parties and general horniness. Their homeworld was a major regional hub due to its status as a key hyperlane junction, which, together with the friendliness of the locals, made Zeltros a popular stop for spacers. Zeltros became quite wealthy over the millennia, and by the time of the Clone Wars, it had a reputation as the party planet. Close at hand was Virajansi, the next stop rimward on the Great Kashyyyk branch, which wound out from Zeltros into the Rim. Virajansi was a very old human colony known for its society's complex hierarchy and the great tunnels that the native ball crawlers dug through its crust. It was also a noteworthy battlefield, having been the site of both the first battles of the Alsacan conflicts and a major battle of the Clone Wars. It was in the latter battle that Anakin Skywalker earned renown through the Republic, having won the battle nigh single-handedly with his starfighter skills. For this, the people of Virajansi awarded him the title of Warrior of the Infinite, and the Holonet News branded him the hero with no fear. The Lesser Lentilian route curved back toward the Polemian before turning back out toward the Rim, and along it were a number of noteworthy planets. Close to Zeltros was the Mercen system, which was plagued by pirates, past which the route passed through the Aeron and Japrael sectors. The Aeron sector contained the Stennis node, a dense cluster of inhabited systems mostly given over to mining operations, which provided raw materials for the Corwood mech worlds. The Stennis node was home to a staggering 25 intelligent species, collectively known as the Nessies, among whom were the Ithulians of Ithul, who were wiped out by the Mandalorians in a war over a distillery, and the Amarans of Amar, a species of fox people. Also located in the Stennis node was the Stennis Hyperspace Terminal, a major port during the post-Mandaron period, run by Bugger the Hutt, who had an estate on the nearby moon of Vodasha. During the Clone Wars, there was another space station in this region called the Rig, the home of a branch of the Bounty Hunters Guild that pursued separatist bounties on Jedi to their eventual misfortune. Lastly, there was Umbria, a planet that was ravaged and drowned in the dark side by a Sith witch before being cleansed by the Jedi Master Thon. It was largely a wasteland, but Thon was able to confine the dark side presence on the planet to the treacherous Lake Nath. Darth Bane and Darth Xana lived on Umbria for 10 years following the end of the New Sith Wars, and a decade after they packed up and left, they returned to the planet to fight their last duel, in which Xana usurped the title of Dark Lord of the Sith. Past the Aeron sector was the Japrael sector, home to Onderon and its jungle moon, Duxon. Onderon had only one settlement, the great walled city of Iziz, which was established as a haven against the flying beasts that migrated to the planet from its dangerous demon moon. Onderon was ruled by Sith Lord Freedon Nad early in its history, while Duxon was once the site of the Mandalorians' headquarters. As a result, the planet saw battle in nearly all of the old Sith Wars. By the time of the Clone Wars, however, Onderon had put its Sith history behind it, and it was more notable as a shipping hub and political powerhouse. Just a short hop from Onderon was another frequent battlefield, Porus Vida, which saw numerous battles during the Alsacan conflicts. Between the Lesser Lantilian route and the Polemian was the Hapes cluster, a brilliant tangle of stars and nebulae, the latter known as the Transitory Mists, under the control of the Hapes Consortium, another allied region of the Republic. The Hapes Consortium was a matriarchal society established by the former concubines of the Lorel Raiders. It was ruled from Hapes, a beautiful planet renowned for its similarly beautiful people and night sky, which lit up each night with brilliant nebulae and the light of 7 moons. The Happans had dozens of colony worlds hidden within their transitory mists. The wealthiest of these worlds were located in the interior region, while other parts of the Hapes cluster included the Rifle worlds, the Gate worlds, the Lorelli Reach, the Corsair Outback, and the Happan Rim worlds. Like the peoples of the Tarlac regions, the Happans were isolationists, and for most of their history, they kept the Hapes cluster completely closed to outsiders. South of the Trellin trade route, the Inner Rim got a bit more sparse. Sectors in this part of the region included the Elos sector and the Inner Cluster, a star cluster which contained the planet Kona, the home of the desert-dwelling collective-minded Arcona. Close to Kona were the Duros colony of Fadden and Manan, the home of the aquatic Selkath. During the era of the Old Republic, Manan was one of the most important planets in the galaxy, as the ocean world was the only source of the powerful healing agent Kolto. Kolto was in high demand in the years before Bacta became widely available, and the Selkath made a killing selling it. They built the floating metropolis Ahto City on the surface of their oceans, which they used as a hub for exporting Kolto. The Selkath leveraged their control of the Kolto trade to stay firmly neutral in galactic politics, threatening to destroy the source of the Kolto if anyone ever tried to invade Manan, and insisting on selling Kolto to both sides whenever war broke out. The Selkath weren't Republic members, and they were generally isolationists in all respects, aside from the Kolto trade. Their frequent both-sidesing earned the Selkath plenty of ill will from the outside galaxy, but the Selkath didn't really care, since they disliked outsiders anyway and figured that their Kolto made them untouchable. But then, Bacta came onto the scene, and Kolto's value plummeted, destroying the Selkath economy. By the time of the Clone Wars, Manan was a backwater, the Selkath had retreated to the ocean depths, and the ruins of Ahto City were the only remaining monument to the planet's former prestige. Not far south of Manan was Truine, another ocean world colonized by Carcharodon and Petrolian settlers, the former home of another Jedi enclave. Close to Truine was Banasthal, the homeworld of the winged Banasthors. These two worlds were located in a sparsely populated part of space, which was interrupted just south of the Truine by the Nanthri route. On the Nanthri route was the Prindar system, a binary system orbited by the gas giant Antar. Antar had 2 inhabited moons, the mining colony of Antar 5 and Antar 4, the homeworld of the Gotals. Antar 4 had a highly magnetic metal-rich crust, which led the Gotals evolving a special pair of horn-looking sensory organs that helped them detect electromagnetic fluctuations. Antar 4 wasn't the most habitable of moons. Its parent planet occasionally blocked out all light from both of the system's suns, plunging the entire moon into darkness, and the moon also experienced erratic seasons and extreme tides. Nonetheless, its population numbered in the billions, and the Gotals had a robust civilization with a prominent place in local geopolitics. The Gotal largely lacked government, and their society could be categorized as anarchistic, with many Gotals living in communes. However, Antar 4 did have the Antarian Rangers, a local peacekeeping group affiliated with the Jedi Order, which kept the moon relatively safe. The Gotals joined the Republic very early in its history, and their homeworld grew prosperous through its control of shipping along the Nanthri route. South of the Nanthri route, there was the Duros colony of Atapap 1 and Alon, the home of the famed Alon Nova Guard. The members of the Alon Nova Guard, which numbered close to 1 billion total, were some of the most effective soldiers in the galaxy, renowned for their skill and discipline. They were considered by some to be on par with the Mandalorians, though unlike with the Mandalorians, the Alon Nova Guard was strictly regimented, even to the point of being quasi-fascistic, with a near religious devotion to martial tradition. This brings us to the Corellian Run on the other end of the slice. Close to the Inner Rim's border with the Colonies, the Corellian Run intersected the Hydian Way, and at the crossroads lay the Iceno sector, the most populous part of the entire region. The Iceno sector contained Ardru, home to powerful business interests, Iceno, a high-gravity planet with a strong, if largely ceremonial, military tradition, and Denon, the heart of the sector, a city planet with over 500 billion. Denon was one of the most popular city planets in the galaxy, second only to Coruscant itself, located at the aforementioned crossroads of the Corellian Run and the Hydian. It was an extremely wealthy world, home to many powerful business interests, and in conflict after conflict, it was a stronghold of the Republic, guarding the core against threats from the south. During the Clone Wars, the slice portion of the Inner Rim lay entirely within Loyalist space. There were several Loyalist strongholds in the region, most notably Denon, Iceno, Tanab, and Ilon, and the Ilon Nova Guard participated in several battles alongside the Grand Army of the Republic. The Iceno sector and the surrounding region were patrolled by the 2nd Sector Army, or Green Mantle Command, which, among other things, was charged with securing the Denon hyperspace crossroads. The Polemian Run portion of the region, meanwhile, was patrolled by Steel Blade Command, the 3rd Sector Army, which prevented separatist advances down the Polemian and did its best to blockade Colicoid territory. The core of the Inner Rim within the slice lay within Oversector 4, the territory of White Kuras Command, which was tasked with keeping the separatists out of the inner slice. Nonetheless, the region did contain a handful of separatist enclaves. Cola 4 and the surrounding pocket of space joined the Confederacy at the start of the war and remained separatist-controlled to the end, despite repeated Republic assaults. Onderon, meanwhile, was eventually retaken. It had joined the separatist movement before the war, after the separatist Sanjay Rash was installed as king. But when Rash was ousted in a Republic-backed revolution in 20 BBY, Onderon and the Japrael sector rejoined the Republic. Apart from these two enclaves, the Confederacy repeatedly encroached on Republic territory in the Inner Rim over the course of the war. Early in the war, separatist forces unsuccessfully attacked Virujansi on the Great Kashyyyk branch and enlisted privateers to harass shipping in the Mercen system. In 20 BBY, the Confederacy was successful in capturing Antar 4, which it held for at least a year. Prior to the war, Antar 4 had been a flashpoint in the separatist crisis, as the moon was home to two powerful separatist factions, the Gotal Assembly for Separation and its terrorist wing, the Roshu Sun. The Roshu Sun and its more legitimate backers were kept in check by the Jedi, but they took over the Findar system after the separatist invasion, and they held it for a short while before Republic forces advanced back down the Nanthri route. Now it's time to talk about the expansion region, the part of the slice where the Republic's early history took a dark turn. Nearly all of this part of the slice was explored between 20,000 and 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, mostly during the Great Manifest period. Exploration in this region was extremely rapid, to the great detriment of the people living there. Much of the expansion region was first explored by the Grand Companies, a collection of Duros and Nemoidian-run Coruscant-backed megacorporations that were looking for planets to strip of resources. Their depredations devastated the expansion region, depopulating entire star systems. Less destructive colonization efforts in the region were backed by Alsakan, but conflict between Alsakani settlers and the Grand Companies sparked off the first of the Alsakan conflicts, which devastated the expansion region even further. And the region continued to fare poorly in war after war, with the new Sith Wars in particular doing even more damage to this already destitute part of space. Thus, by the time of the Clone Wars, the expansion region stood in stark contrast to the rest of the slice. While the slice as a whole had a reputation as the heartland of the Republic, well settled and prosperous, the expansion region was anything but. Of course, the expansion region wasn't completely desolate, and it actually had more major routes than the inner rim portion of the slice. These were, however, spread across a much larger region, and unlike in other parts of the slice, nearly all of the routes through the expansion region just passed through it. South of the Plemian trade route, the expansion region was crossed by the Lesser Lantilian route and the Great Kashyyyk branch, while further south, the Nanthri route continued on its winding path to the mid-rim. Another major hyperspace route split off from the Nanthri route at Gindin, the Utmian Pobol, which was once the primary route between the Republic and Hutt Space. Another major route branched off from this region's leg of the Corellian Run, the Gamor Run, which also ran out to Hutt Space. There were other routes in the expansion region, of course, but many of them were obscure, and there were entire sectors here that it was difficult to find reliable navigational data for. Not that there were many people looking for such data. There wasn't all that much to see in the dead sectors at the expansion region's heart. The expansion region is the first region that we have a complete sector map for, which you can see on screen. As with individual systems, we won't be listing out every single sector in this and the subsequent regions, just the notable ones. The slice portion of the expansion region could be divided into 3 sub-regions: the former Alsakani colonies near the Polemian, the Corellian-dominated worlds near the Corellian Run, and the exploitation region, the central portion of the expansion region, so named because of the depredations of the Grand Companies. In the interests of shaking things up, we're going to start with the Corellian Run worlds, whose history and culture differed sharply from the rest of the expansion region. As you may remember from the Republic History series, the Corellians were neutral in the Alsakan conflicts, and they jealously guarded their colonies in the expansion region from both sides. The bulk of these were actually west of the Corellian Run in the region known as the Trailing Sectors, but the Corellians also controlled the Run itself, the sectors along it, and a few other sectors close at hand. These sectors tended to be wealthier and better populated than the rest of the expansion region, and they often classified themselves as part of the Trailing Sectors to distance themselves from their neighbors to the north. The core part of the expansion region was the 77 sectors, the subsectors that the Corellian Run passed through on its way through the expansion region. By the time of the Clone Wars, these subsectors were part of the larger Merthian, Palamut, Kylion, Tina, Imera, Navath, Chaikin, Brak, and Thayera sectors, which stretched across both sides of the Corellian Run. The Corellian Run worlds and their surrounding sectors in the slice were home to a few sentient species, among them the lizard-like Terrassians of Colorin, the Narvath of planet Narvath, the reptilian Chubbits of the desert planet Aridus, the winged mammalian Bavarians of the jungle world Bova Yagan, and the naturally telepathic horned Iktochi of the windswept moon Iktoch. The Iktochi were the most noteworthy of these people, known for their hardiness, stoic attitudes, and their close relationship with the Jedi Order. They were a minor local political power, having been enthusiastic partners of the Republic for millennia. There were other notable Corellian Run worlds in the expansion region as well. 2 of these were desert planet Romamamul and its twin planet Osarian, the inhabitants of whom were constantly at odds and fought many wars with each other. There was also Alantine 6, home to the famous Alantine 6 shipyards and the industrial trade worlds Milagro, Mercat, Gamor, and Bakrana. The worlds of the Tharian system were also power players in local trade. Also within this region was the peculiar Kularan system, which had long ago been altered by Sith meddling. There were 2 noteworthy planets in this system, Kularin itself, the homeworld of the Tarasians, and the bizarre planet Almas, home to an old Sith fortress built by Darth Riven during the New Sith Wars. North of these sectors was the southern part of the exploitation region, which was largely desolate apart from the Gamor Run worlds, with many systems in the region stripped of all resources and/or plagued by pirates. Traces of industry remained, notably on the desert planet Zarek Senda on Gerholt III, a former flashpoint of the Alsakan conflicts, and on Suron, the homeworld of the hive-minded Suronians and their shipbuilding firm, Suron Startech. A few other species called this region home. There were the bizarre Groovians of Gruvia, the constantly warring Dimok and Riplobus of the Sepan system, and the Dimines, whose warlord Krat once controlled the entire Dimine sector before a chance encounter with Jedi Padawan Jolee Bindo a few years before the Great Sith War. Further north, at the heart of the exploitation region, was a strip of sectors south of the Nan-3 route that, during the final centuries of the Republic, were partially dominated by the Hutts, representing the westmost expanse of the Hutt sphere of influence. One of these sectors, the Cerulean Protectorate, was a productive industrial region, a rare hub of commerce in the expansion region. Centered around the densely populated, heavily industrialized planet Cerelia, a noteworthy droid maker and ancient industrial powerhouse, the Cerulean Protectorate also contained the trade world Prazi, homeworld of the long-lived Zex and Saraban, which had its own indigenous species. The neighboring sectors, however, were much less lively. A few lesser-known species called this part of space home: the insectoid Bolovians of Bolovia, the Tur of the desolate world of the same name, and the Mordegean of Mordegan. Other points of note were the planet Embeline, the homeworld of the Mistral Shadow Guards, the Farfalla system in the Indra Su Mars sector, the capital of a new Sith Wars era kingdom ruled by Jedi Lord Valentine Farfalla, and the Null Zone, a small, obscure region completely devoid of stars where a number of sketchy characters built space stations over the years. On the other side of the Nan-3 route, between the Utmi and Pobol, was a wide stretch of unfortunate industrial and resource worlds, the victims of some of the worst of the expansion region's history. Noteworthy worlds here include the frigid planet Zerulast, which orbited a white dwarf and was home to the Temolak, species of scavengers, Axion, a remote colony of the Colicoids, the garbage planet Atahox, Chanosant, once a stronghold of the separatist movement, and the agri world Wraither. This part of space also contained Belasco, an industrial world that had once been the central hub of many hyperspace routes in the exploitation region. This made it prominent and wealthy long after those routes were lost, unlike most of its neighbors. Belasco had a very long history, playing a major role all throughout the Alsacan conflicts and the settlement of the Slice. By the time of the Clone Wars, its ancient monarchy had very recently been replaced with a democratic government. The Circopus sector, where the two routes met, was a bit of a step up from most of the region, better off due to its access to two important trade routes. The Circopus system, which gave the sector its name, had three settled worlds: the industrial world Circopus 3, the urbanized financial hub Circopus 4, and the mining world Circopus 5, a swampy world known to its natives as Mimban. Home to the green-skinned Mimbanites and the red-skinned Kowe, Mimban was home to an ancient temple that housed the Kyber crystal, a mysterious and powerful Force-attuned relic. Also located in the Circopus sector was Gindine, an industrial and administrative world that, unlike most of its neighbors, was fairly prosperous and important. It controlled the orbiting Gindine shipyards and had a number of factories and reclamation yards on its surface, and as a result, it had a fair bit of economic power. Its sector neighbors included the Corellian colonies of the Ashana system, the IGBC-controlled planet Niro, and Fabrin, the headquarters of the mega-corporation Fabritech. There wasn't all that much between the Utmi and Pobol and the Great Kashyyyk branch, apart from a few noteworthy sentient species. The belligerent Hraskis of the eponymous planet, the humanoid Nurians of Nuri, and the near-human Imzig of Corone. Also worth mentioning are the Selgians of Selgia, one of the most unique species in the Star Wars galaxy. These guys came from a stormy ocean world with an atmosphere of cyanogen gas, a highly dangerous compound that metabolizes to cyanide in the human body. The Selgians were a species of telepathic floating brains with tentacles. They breathed cyanogen, and oxygen was highly lethal to them. The most famous Selgian was Jedi Master Uru, a hero of the Great Hyperspace War. Located along the Great Kashyyyk branch was the Ghost Nebula, a dense cloud of ionized plasma. The Great Kashyyyk branch ran through an easy-to-navigate stretch of nebula, but the Ghost Nebula as a whole was vast and hard to navigate in places. Two notable planets lay within: Atoa, an ice planet home to a species of near-humans, and Umbara, which lay directly on the Great Kashyyyk branch. We're sure you've heard of Umbara before. This famous jungle planet was constantly shrouded in darkness due to the Ghost Nebula, which blocked out some of the light of Umbara's star. Umbara was a jungle planet full of deeply alien bioluminescent plants and animals, and it was home to the near-human Umbarans, an isolationist and highly advanced species known for their ability to see in the ultraviolet spectrum and their gift for politics and manipulation. Umbara was a long-standing member of the Republic, but its relationship with the Republic was fairly one-sided. The Umbarans were a powerful and highly influential force in Republic politics and had been for tens of thousands of years. But Umbara itself saw few visitors and rarely engaged in trade with other Republic worlds. Rather, Umbara's power came from its control of other systems' trade on the Great Kashyyyk branch, which it attempted to exploit during the Clone Wars when it jumped ship and joined the CIS in 21 BBY. The parts of the expansion region north of the Ghost Nebula were settled by Al-Sakani colonists during the Great Manifest period, but over the course of the region's history, they had been ravaged by war and disease, leaving little of interest in the region. There were a few traces of industry. The poisoned factory planet Bivren was an example of a minor industrial world, while Valgoth and Denovia were originally both unpleasant mining worlds, though by the time of the Clone Wars, Valgoth had become a toxic scrapyard instead. There was one noteworthy sentient species here, the Viren Tess, as well as two well-populated, partly urbanized worlds on the Lesser Lantilian route, Dona Laza, home to a famous Tapcaf and adjoining spaceport, and Vina, a Baroni whose people were descended from settlers from the Hapes cluster. The Vinans were isolationists, and they were one of the few allies of the Hapes consortium. Finally, we come to the Plemian trade route, or at least the tiny part of it that runs through the expansion region. All of the expansion region leg of the Plemian was located in the Low Cris sector, the capital of which was Sumeria, an ancient agri-world on the Plemian trade route. The slice portion of the expansion region was heavily divided at the start of the Clone Wars. The northernmost sliver along the Plemian fell within the territory of the 3rd Sector Army and was firmly under Republic control for the entirety of the war, while the core of the expansion region, which lay within the territory of the 4th Sector Army, contained a large region of separatist space, the coreward tip of the Confederacy's largest enclave of territory. This enclave would be designated the Felucia Theatre during the Outer Rim sieges, though by that point it had been reduced in size, and most of the Separatists' expansion region territories had been recaptured. The borders of Separatist territory in the heart of the expansion region are actually clearly visible on the region's sector map. They were the sectors between the Utmian Pobol and the Nanthri route. All told, these were the Sikapus, Askarian, and Hokatar sectors along the Nanthri route, the Haron, Belasco, and Axion sectors along the Utmian Pobol, and the Haron Marches, Serathrace sector, Hangshan sector, and Tolmaces sector between. The Republic didn't really have any strongholds within the expansion region portion of the slice. The sector armies that maintained here operated out of bases in coreward systems, or the trailing sectors. The same wasn't true for the Separatists, who had the industrial capacities of Gindyne and Sikapus IV and the political power of Belasco and Chanosant to make use of, as well as established deep space shipyards in the region, such as the Tambor Deep Space Center. There were many battles within this region over the course of the Clone Wars. The Battle of Mimban, fought early in the war, was the most well known. Early Republic advances in this region seem to have failed, as in 21 BBY, Separatist forces were able to advance from Gindyne through the Maladi sector to take Antar IV. The late 21 BBY secession of Umbara worsened Republic fortunes even further, as this cut off Republic supply lines on the Great Kashyyyk branch, inhibiting the Republic's access to its last secure route through this part of the slice. But the tide eventually turned in the other direction. In the Battle of Umbara in late 21 BBY, the Republic recaptured Umbara, albeit at a high cost, reopening the Great Kashyyyk branch. Over the course of 20 and 19 BBY, Republic forces made huge strides in the expansion region, reclaiming every last one of the region's separatist sectors. Now and again, the separatists pushed back, laying waste to Parcellus Minor during an advance through the Parcellus sector, and backing the armies of Emberline as they attempted to conquer the other peoples of the Othala sector. The southern chunk of the expansion region lay within the territory of the 16th Sector Army, Ivory Fang Command. Ivory Fang spent much of the Clone Wars securing territory in the trailing sectors, but it was also constantly putting out fires on the Corellian Run, where the CIS had an enclave early in the war. The Brack, Chaikin, and Emeria sectors seceded during the Separatist crisis, and by the start of the Clone Wars, the Confederacy had also annexed part of the Kalion, Narvath, and Thari sectors as well. As a result, this part of the Corellian Run saw heavy fighting, especially in the Clone Wars, when the Confederacy attempted to advance forward through this region. Allentine 6 was a Republic stronghold fairly early in the Clone Wars, and its shipyards built a number of Venator-class Star Destroyers, including the Resolute, Anakin Skywalker's flagship. By a year into the war, however, Allentine 6 lay within Separatist space. This likely happened around the same time as a number of other Separatist advances in the region, including assaults on Iktoch and Terra Sul. But this Separatist advance didn't last long. Between 21 BBY and mid-20 BBY, Republic forces advanced down the Corellian Run, winning a string of victories that saw the reconquest of many of the Separatist sectors on the route. And by the start of the Outer Rim sieges in late 20 BBY, the Republic had complete control of this oversector. One of the largest chunks of the slice was the portion located in the Mid-Rim. The northern and southern portions of the Mid-Rim were charted and settled during the Great Manifest period and the Indrexu era, while the interior, which lay on the edge of Hutt Space, wasn't fully charted until around 10,000 BBY after the end of the Pius Dea era. It took millennia for the Mid-Rim to be fully settled, however, and even by the time of the Clone Wars, discovering new habitable planets in the region was still a possibility, if an extremely rare one. Unlike the expansion region, where corporations ran wild and despoiled whole sectors, and unlike the Outer Rim, which from the beginning was thick with outlaws and pirates, the Mid-Rim portion of the slice had been mostly settled by legitimate small-time groups who created thriving regional communities with many alien civilizations that already existed in the area. The corporations largely stayed out of the Mid-Rim since they already had free reign in the expansion region, while the outlaws flocked to the Outer Rim where Republic authority was looser. As a result, the Mid-Rim became a place of agriculture, low-cost manufacturing, and former frontier settlements, home to some of the most powerful and respected cultures in the Republic. In stark contrast to the expansion region, the Mid-Rim of the slice was packed with major trade routes. One set of routes formed the backbone of the region, winding between the Polemian trade route and the Corellian Run. The Randan Run ran from Lentils on the Polemian to Randan at the other end of the Kashyyyk region, past which the route morphed into the Trax Tube, which went from Randon to Delung. From Delung, the Bothan Run passed through Bothan Space to Manda, a hub on the Manda merchant route, which linked Mon Gaza on the Corellian Run to the worlds of the Outer Rim's Abrion sector. There was also a shortcut on the Bothan Run that bypassed Bothan Space, the Askar Trace, which looped from Lanik to Lerator. Additionally, the Rena trade route directly linked Bothawui to the Corellian Run. The Nanthri route terminated in the Mid-Rim, as did the Kashyyyk branch, which merged with the Lesser Lantilian route at Charos 4, past which the Lesser Lantilians struck out into the Outer Rim. The Utmian Pobol, which began in the expansion region, passed through the Mid-Rim on its way to Hutt Space. Many other major Mid-Rim routes led to Hutt Space as well. You had the Pobol Slayeron, which started at Randon, the Gamor Run, which crossed the Delung hyperspace crossroads on its way to Hutt Space, and the Kagar Run, which began at Bothawui. From here on, we're going to be looking at the Mid-Rim in two parts, divided more or less at the Dalung hyperspace crossroads. We'll start now with the northern part, with the southern part to come later. The heart of the northern Mid-Rim was the Kashyyyk region, a cluster of slice sectors centered around Kashyyyk with immense strategic, economic, and political importance. These sectors were crossed by several major hyperspace routes and are home to a dizzying number of powerful civilizations which dominated the northern mid-rim. The Wookiees and their longtime rivals, the Trandoshans, were the most famous of these, but there were also the Saurians, who were relatives of the Trandoshans, the enterprising Bims, and two major human civilizations, the Randoni and the Lentilians. A number of outsider civilizations had influence in the Kashyyyk region as well. The Hutts controlled part of the region's rimward sectors, but their influence was kept in check in part by the Bothans and Laniks, two southern mid-rim species that we'll talk about later. In the northwest, the Polemian trade route passed through the Kashyyyk region in the Lantilian sector, a densely populated territory that was one of the Republic's most ancient regions. The capital of this sector was Lantils, a human-dominated industrial world. The Lantilians were quite powerful and controlled shipping along the outer Polemian, as well as throughout the northern Kashyyyk region. Lantils was a major industrial world known for its shipbuilding industry, which was led by Lentilian shipwrights. Lentilian products tended to emphasize practical concerns over style, and the typical Lentilian mindset was best summarized by the motto of one of the planet's largest shipbuilders: "We make space travel less exciting." Coreward of Lantils on the Polemian was the major trade world, Geyser, which was also ancient but was regularly overshadowed by its more powerful neighbor. From Lantils, the Randon Run struck out south through the Kashyyyk region, passing Fasira, a manufacturing world. Near the major agri-world Oita, it was crossed by the lesser Lentilian route, which was largely controlled by Lentilian business interests. In the Lentilian sector, the lesser Lentilian route led past Nazri, the homeworld of the isolationist and fanatically religious Nazar and Avenel, a resort where Lentilian business executives like to go on vacation or retire. Past Oita, the lesser Lentilian route pushed into the Taldot sector, where it crossed Togoria and Charos IV. Togoria was a simple, unspoiled world home to the Togorians, a species of stubborn, extremely buff cat people who chose to live relatively low-tech lives in isolation from the rest of the galaxy. Togoria shared a system with Thanos, a minor shipyard world. Charos IV, on the other hand, was home to the Gi-Charians, the insectoid inventors of the Vulture Droid. The Gi-Charians followed the religion of Shi-Char, which taught that industrial manufacturing was a sacred undertaking. Consequently, the Gi-Charians covered their arid mountainous homeworld with ornate cathedral factories, where they made some of the most high-quality droid starfighters and tanks on the market. Many of the Shi-Char cathedral factories were operated by Howard Chul Engineering, a major backer of the CIS. Charos IV was also where the Great Kashyyyk branch merged into the lesser Lentilian route. The Taldot sector also contained the Great Kashyyyk branch agri-world Balamak and Rathalay, a resort world known for its tropical beaches. The Hala sector formed the eastmost part of the Kashyyyk region, sharing a border with Hutt Space. It was dominated by the Bims of Bimisari, two entirely unrelated species that shared a homeworld, language, and culture. The indigenous Bims were furry mammals, while the other Bims were near-human dwarfs that had assimilated into the planet's society circa 2000 BBY. Bimisari was a thriving trade world full of rolling plains dotted with the occasional Bim city, which had large markets and typically busy starports. The Bims were master traders, which gave them considerable economic power in the Kashyyyk region. They shared their sector with Sejan Siji and the Safa, both from planets of the same name, as well as with the mining world Danuta, the old military world Ord Tabul, and the industrial world Pegshar 1. Deep in the Hala sector, close to Hutt Space, was Buzz Pity, the graveyard planet. It was formerly home to the enormous Gigantels, a primitive but extremely tough species that the Hutts wanted to take as slaves. But the Gigantels had rebuffed all Hutt entreaties. The Hutts sent 7 armies of Nikto to conquer Buzz Pity and 4 teams of Talundatil negotiators to win the Gigantels over, but the Gigantels responded every time by just eating the Hutt servants. Enraged, the Hutts sent a team of Nimbanel lawyers to Buzz Pity's twin planet, Morn, which was home to the Electric Caliphs, ancient droids that had been abandoned when their master and maker died 10,000 years before. The Nimbanels instilled the Electric Caliphs with a sense of obsolescence and suicidal nihilism and then unleashed them against Boz-Pity. The Electric Caliphs wiped out the Gigantels before returning to Morn and setting the planet on fire, destroying themselves and everything on Morn's crust. By the time of the Clone Wars, Morn still burned after thousands of years, its atmosphere choked with black smoke, while Boz-Pity was an empty world of plains, ruins, and enormous gravestones. The Mytaranor sector, the center of the region, contained Kashyyyk and Trandosha, but its capital was Randon, a key human-dominated trading world. Randon lay at the junction of the Utmian Pobol, the Pobol Slahayron, the Trax Tube, and the Randon Run, and it was one of the Mid-Rim's wealthiest trading worlds due to its location at such an important hyperspace nexus. The Randon Run linked it to Mesert, the financial hub of the sector, and Chambel, the headquarters of Bunch Tech, as well as Kashyyyk. Kashyyyk, and to a lesser degree its sister planet Trandosha, was possibly even more important, however. Located at the intersection of the Randon Route with the Great Kashyyyk Branch and the Dirk Teal Loop, Kashyyyk was a forest planet completely covered by kilometers-tall Roshia trees, at the tops of which lived the Wookiees, one of the most powerful species in the Mid-Rim. Honored for their wisdom in galactic and local politics and wealthy due to their artisanal skills and control of trade routes, the Wookiees had come a long way since their introduction to galactic civilization, which saw Kashyyyk enslaved by the vicious Zerka Corporation. But since then, Kashyyyk had become a vital spaceport with thriving shipbuilding and star-charting industries. The Klatifak Guild, a secret society of Wookiee navigators, forged hyperspace routes all over the region, and indeed all over the galaxy, that were only known to themselves, giving the Wookiees a decisive edge in regional shipping. The Wookiees prospered greatly from this, becoming one of the Northern Mid-Rim's primary powers. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Wookiees had established many colonies in the surrounding sector, most prominently on the forest moon Alaris Prime in the Kashyyyk system, Rakhun on the Randon Run, and Wukru on the Dirk Teal Loop. The Trandoshans, the lizard-like natives of the desert world Trandosha, were usually overshadowed by their planetary neighbors, but their heavy involvement in the galactic underworld gave them influence of a different sort. They represented the other side of the Mytaranor sector, a decidedly seedier side. While Kashyyyk and Randon were bastions of legitimate trade, pirates, slavers, bounty hunters, and mercenaries plagued other parts of the sector. The hubs of this underworld lay on the Night Road, which went from Trandosha to Turskiar in the next sector over. Apart from Trandosha, these underworld hubs were Tholatin, a noted smuggler's haunt, and Mytaranor, the sector's namesake, a dismal industrial world home to the brutal Mytaranor Slaving Council. These underworld types also controlled Torn Station, a refueling stop on the sector's border along the Great Kashyyyk Branch. To the southwest, the Mytaranor sector was bordered by the Turskiar and Trax sectors, which were much less wealthy. The Turskiar sector contained Quaskilam, a mining planet on the Great Kashyyyk Branch, and Pisilis, a gas giant on the Night Road orbited by several moons, home to corporate colonies backed by Randon, Rawgam, and Lentils. The Udmian Pobol also ran through here, passing New Absalon, an industrialized world that had a caste system before a Jedi-sponsored revolution ushered in democracy, and Kochel, a system containing the homeworld and 4 colonies of the rabbit-like, rapidly breeding Lepi. In the Turskiar sector, where the Kier system used to be, the Utmian Pobol was routed along the Thornhedge Nebula, an unnavigable supernova remnant with a pulsar at its heart. Another route around the Thornhedge Nebula, the Turskiar Pass, cut through the Track sector to Daysum 3. Located along it was the Basilarus system, containing the planets Nurston, a rich source of ore, and the agri-world Drenel's Point. The Track sector was dominated by the Trax Tube and contained a string of economically significant worlds, including Daysum 3, which corporate profiteers had orbit stripped of life and resources, Genian, a neutral world known for its bank and corporate holdings, the urban planet Lexrul, the resort world Entrus, Rehern, the homeworld of the Adilians, Longwind, a local textile center, Essowin, an asteroid-scoured mining world home to 2 species, the Sultan and the Hoskar, and Velity, an agri-world home to the near-human Bornek. But the Track sector was also plagued by pirates who frequently raided the Trax Tube. These pirates tended to stop for servicing at Awugo Core, the home of the long-suffering Awugo, a minor port on the tube. Rimward of the track's tube was the Castellar sector, a sector divided between Hutt influence and the territory of the Solren, the distant relatives of the Trandoshans. Unlike the Trandoshans, the Solren became local power players legitimately. Their homeworld, Dirktil on the Dirktil Loop, was a wealthy agri-world, and the Solren controlled a considerable chunk of the trade between the Republic and Hutt Space. The loop also passed Sneeve, the homeworld of the Sneevils, before it merged with the Pabol Slaheron at the agri-world Yitabo. Further down the Pabol Slaheron was Chalacta, the home of the Chalactans, a peaceful people famed for their mystics. The Udmi and Pabol also crossed through the Castellar sector, passing the industrial world Obrikia, a mech world home to the Hutt-dominated company Ubrikian Industries, the tertiary moon of Blimph, home to the Doug-like Jokali, and Quen, which was orbited by a space station that served as the official entry port for Hutt Space. Also in the Castellar sector was the Hutt-dominated urban planet Katala and the Hutt-owned mining world Gavos. To the northeast of the Kashyyyk region, the Polemian trade route continued onto the Outer Rim, passing a series of sectors with a long history of industrial activity. Along the Polemian itself was Jael, the home of Riber manufacturing, Ringovinda, a major manufacturing world encircled by an artificial ring, which served as a massive distribution station for the planet's products, and Abheen, the host of the orbital Abheen shipyards, which was originally a Republic Navy facility. There was also Roach, the home of the insectoid Verpine. The Verpine were some of the galaxy's most gifted engineers, renowned for the weapons, droids, personal equipment, and starfighters they designed and manufactured. This included the Republic's V-19 Torrents, which were designed by the Verpine companies Slane and Corpil. The Verpine's home, Roach, was not a planet, but rather a huge asteroid field, where hundreds of asteroids had been converted into Verpine settlements and manufacturing facilities. These Polemian worlds weren't the only industrial planets in this region either. The Roach sector also contained Fradian, a regional ore depot, while the Maldrud sector contained Gunzik, a minor shipyard and the home of starship manufacturer Messens Corporation. Talsia was a major manufacturer of thermal detonators, Snowy Diado housed a separatist starfighter factory, Resilon was a mining world, Loken 3 hosted Transtech droid works, and the Maltorian mining belt was a major regional ore supplier. Metalorn in the Talcine sector was one of the Techno-Union's most treasured mech worlds. Once, it had been home to humid rainforests, but the Techno-Union had completely urbanized the planet, covering it with continent-sized factory blocks and enormous polluted wastelands. During the Clone Wars, Metalorn was one of Wat Tamba's favored mech worlds, and the planet was one of the Confederacy's foremost droid makers. The northwestern mid-rim also boasted a number of trade worlds. Useron was best known as a shadow port, but its people, the Useron, were desperately trying to legitimize themselves by the time of the Clone Wars, hosting the Galactic Games in hopes that this would give their economy a boost. The Wheel, an enormous space station in the Maldrud sector's Besh Gorgon system, was a vast resort owned by Senator Simon Greyshade, home to lots of casinos and lots of spies and criminals who made the station an excellent place to gather information. Lastly, there was Centaurus, the last major spaceport on the Polemian before it plunged into the Outer Rim, a major trade and industrial world. The Outer Polemian was also a region with a lot of history, some of it ancient. During the Tynese War, the Republic's very first war, the region was the front line between the Republic and the Honorable Union of Decivero and Tion. Several worlds of the Usa sector, most notably Ulthara and Okator 8, were battlefields in this war. It was ravaged again during the Clone Wars, in which Karam V was terrorized by separatist-backed dictator Addo Emon, and Orleans' entire population of 800 million was rendered homeless after Republic forces bombed it with weaponized stone mites in retaliation for a perceived attack on Coruscant. This attack on Coruscant was actually just a tragic accident, but by the time that came to light, the stone mites had already eaten every building on Orleans and were busy chewing apart its crust. Close by was New Holstis, a hospital world home to a monument bearing the name of every Jedi ever killed. somewhat removed from the Pleiadian itself were the homeworlds of a bunch of significant species. Sarka was a humid jungle world home to the reptilian Sarkans, who were a minor political power in the region thanks to their homeworld's mineral wealth. The Vidav of the rocky planet Vidav were also miners, while the Anzati of the legendary planet Anzat were most renowned for their assassins. As a whole, the Anzati were feared, as they fed on the life forces of sentient beings, and their combat techniques were some of the most effective in the galaxy. They shared their corner of space with the Villasaurians of Villasauria, the Thenkora of Thenkor, the Gosfamblings of Gosfambling, and the Ultarian Greenbacks of Ultar. South of the Kashyyyk region, the Trax tube wound down to Dalung, knitting together the interior of the Mid-Rim. In contrast to the bustling northern and southern parts of the Mid-Rim, this area was sparsely populated, mostly consisting of obscure mining worlds and long-forgotten colonies. After leaving the Trax sector, the tube passed through the Terab and Kurost sectors. These sectors were both known pretty much only for their mining worlds, which included Drogheda, a world rich in natural resources ruled by a hereditary monarch, Istik II, home of the Extichians, which was irradiated but ore-rich, Avaril, a source of quadranium, Pesmenben IV, a desert world, and the absurdly named Tynes Hawkey, a source of Keshul and Nergon 14. These mining worlds were plentiful because their region was dominated by young stars orbited by metal-rich planets. This region also contained Farquhar III, the site of a separatist droid factory during the Clone Wars, as well as Kurost, the home of the Kurosti merchant fleet, and Danalbeth, the former homeworld of the aquatic Graygle. There were two other worlds in the vicinity of the Trax tube that are worth mentioning. The first is Nunthri, which sat at the intersection of the Trax tube and the Nunthri route. Since this is the fourth section we're talking about the Nunthri route in, you may be excited to finally learn what the hell made Nunthri so important. The answer? We don't know, because the lore establishes next to nothing about the planet apart from that it existed. Apart from the planet itself, however, there was an ancient and mysterious space station of alien origin in the Nunthri system known as the Foundry. The Foundry was commandeered by Revan in HK-47 during the Galactic Wars, and it's notable for being the place where Revan died, the light side part of him anyway. The second important world in this area is Rusan, which lay a good way off the Trax tube in the Terab sector. Originally a pleasant, temperate world home to the floating telepathic bouncers and near-human Rusanians, Rusan was once one of the Terab sector's many mining worlds, a source of copper, iridium, uranium, iron, cesium, and nickel, as well as Rusan crystals. But it was changed forever in 1000 BBY when it became the last battlefield of the new Sith Wars. The Brotherhood of Darkness and the Army of the Light fought 7 battles across the planet, devastating its surface and all but wiping out its inhabitants. The 7th Battle of Rusan saw the final defeat of the Brotherhood and, it was believed, the extinction of the Sith. But this came at a high cost, both to Rusan and to the Jedi, as the Sith detonated a thought bomb at the end of the battle, killing hundreds of Sith and Jedi alike, and trapping their souls in a cave beneath the Valley of the Jedi. After the new Sith Wars, Rusan was left in ruins and abandoned. Its ore reserves had been exhausted and its surface had been laid waste, and as a result, it was pretty much a lost world by the time of the Clone Wars, despite its huge historical significance. Most beings across the Republic knew its name, but barely anyone knew where it was, as it lay in a tangle of nebulae and was far off the beaten path. During the Clone Wars, the Separatists saw this as an opportunity and they chose Rusan's stormy second moon to host Skytop Station, a listening post that they used to gather intelligence on Republic forces in the Slice. On the rimward side of the Trax tube, there was a sparsely settled region on the edge of Hutt Space that lay under Hutt influence during the Clone Wars. It was home to a scattering of worlds that had been battlefields in the ancient conflicts between the Hutt clans and Republic frontier settlers, including Parseve Minor, where the Belasco Free Volunteers defeated a party of Hutt raiders during the Kaimodon era. Ord Yindar and Ord Wyland were established as forward bases for Crusaders fighting the Hutts during the Pius Dea era, while the Signal Star Empire, a small local civilization based on Cygnus B, was believed to have been given a group of Chinese warlords by the Hutts as a bribe during the ancient Zim Wars. At the time of the Clone Wars, Cygnus B was also home to the shipbuilding firm Cygnus Space Works. The Hutt-dominated Isaga sector was home to two warring species, the Freda and the Jante, both of homeworlds of the same names, who maintained colonies in the Retna system. Nearby Defaria was home to the Defarians, an ally of the Bothans. Also located in this region was Peridon's Folly, a remote world where crime lords went to buy obsolete weapons. Past Nanthri, the Trax tube passed the mining world Berison and the notable spaceport Nixor, home of the Nixor species, before terminating at Delung. Delung was a key trade world that lay at one of the Midrim's most important hyperspace junctions, where the Trax tube, Gamel Run and Bothan Run intersected. From Delung, reliable routes struck off into Hutt Space, the Midrim backcountry, the expansion region, and Bothan space. It was incredibly strategically important and the site of many battles over the centuries, especially during the Sith Wars. Delung is also where we're going to stop for now, before picking up with the southern Midrim. The 4th Sector Army maintained a small bit of territory in the Midrim between its expansion region sectors and the Trax tube, from Randon down to Delung. East of its territory along the Trax tube was the domain of the 13th Sector Army, Iron Lance Command, though this was mostly a formality, as most of Iron Lance's operations were further south and its northern Midrim territories were under Hutt control. The rest of the Midrim in the slice was within the territory of the 12th Sector Army, Cerulean's Spear Command, which was based at Lantils. Republic strongholds in this region were limited to Cerulean Spear territory, and even then they were few, limited mostly to Lantils and Roach. New Holstis, while located in Separatist space, was also Republic-controlled, and it was used as a hospital world and staging ground for Republic forces fighting in the Felucia Theatre. Large parts of the northern Mid-Rim were under Separatist control, however, as part of the Separatist enclave in the Felucia Theatre. Along the Trax tube, the Confederacy controlled the Trax, Terab, and Kurost sectors, while in the Kashyyyk region, parts of the Turskia, Mataranor, Castellar, Talbot, and Hulla sectors were also under CIS control. In the northeast, the Life, Bortelli, Brix, Yusa, and Maldred sectors all lay within Separatist space, as did parts of the Tenuta and Talcine sectors. Separatist strongholds in the 4th Army section of this region included Drogheda and Farquhar III, Mining World, and Droidmaker respectively. In the 12th Army's over-sector, the Confederacy had a whole slew of key manufacturing worlds. Indeed, the region known as the Foundry of the Confederacy, the industrial heart of the Separatist war machine, was partially located within the Mid-Rim. Charos IV produced starfighters and tanks, Abheen produced capital ships, and Medalorn produced droids by the billions. Randon and Centauri's were also major Separatist economic and political strongholds, while the local defense forces of the Pasavi system played a major role in the war in this theatre. The CIS also maintained Boz Pity as a stronghold, stationing a vast fleet above the planet and building a fortress on the Graveyard World's desolate surface. The 4th Army's activities in the Mid-Rim were mostly an extension of their expansion region's campaign, aimed at retaking the Trax tube and preventing the Confederacy from capturing the Delung hyperspace crossroads, both objectives that were successful. The 12th Army, meanwhile, had a much tougher time. Throughout the Clone Wars, it fought a constant back and forth war with the Confederacy along the Polemian, with the border between the two sides moving back and forth between Lantils and Centaurus. In the first year of the war, Republic forces won hard-fought victories at Balamak and Medalorn, and 12th Army forces pushed all the way out to Centaurus, only for Separatist forces to rebound in a matter of months, reversing all 3 gains, while General Grievous took Toygoria on the Talbot sector. The slog continued well into 20 BBY. Eventually though, the Republic started to have a bit more luck. Kashyyyk, which was initially neutral due to its proximity to Separatist space, declared full military support for the Republic after Trade Federation droids killed the Wookiee Crown Prince in 20 BBY. This gave the 12th Army another stronghold, but even then, it wasn't until the start of the Outer Rim sieges that progress began to be made. In the Battle of Boz Pity, one of the first of the Outer Rim sieges, Republic forces captured one of the Confederacy's regional strongholds, which they used as a staging ground to attack the Foundry of the Confederacy from a new angle. In the last 6 months of the Clone Wars, Republic forces finally took Centaurus, pushing the front line on the Polemian to the Outer Rim. Medalorn fell for the final time, and Charos IV was captured as well. In 19 BBY, the Confederacy carried out a massive assault on Kashyyyk, trying to reverse their fortunes in the Felucia Theatre. But that battle also ended in a Republic victory, heralding the forthcoming total defeat of the CIS. We'll begin our overview of the southern mid-rim where we left off with the northern rim, just past DeLung. Two great hyperspace routes branched off south from DeLung, the Gamor Run and the Bothan Run. We'll start with the worlds of the Gamor Run, since we already covered part of the route when we talked about the expansion region. In the mid-rim, this ancient and well-travelled route passed through the Madosian and Fehu sectors, linking together a number of historically significant systems. The most famous stop on this leg of the run was Deneba, a former stronghold of the Jedi Order, where in bygone days, Jedi Knights would gather from all over the galaxy in great conclaves. The last Deneba conclave happened in 3997 BBY, and it ended when Krath war droids attacked the gathering and killed several of the Jedi present, sparking the Great Sith War. Also on the Gamor Run was Shador, the swampy, unpleasant homeworld of the Shadorians, the people feared for their assassins. Just off the route, in the Madosian sector, was Chroma Z, the much more pleasant homeworld of the worm-like Chromans. The Gamor Run ran coreward toward the expansion region. In contrast, the Bothan Run ran rimward. After leaving the Deneba sector, it passed through Lannic Space and the Lannic Wilds, the territory of one of the Republic's most prominent mid-rim allies. In case you couldn't guess, these sectors were dominated by the Lannics, one of the most powerful civilizations of the southern mid-rim. The Lannics, who you might know by their most famous member, Jedi Master Evan Peel, were short but tough and aggressive, both highly capable warriors and highly influential in local politics. Together with the Bothans, they played a major role in curtailing Hutt activities in the southern mid-rim. The Lannics' homeworld, Lannic, sat at the crossroads of the Bothan Run and the Askar Trace. It was a rocky, largely undeveloped world ruled by a hereditary monarchy. It lay at the heart of Lannic Space, which contained a number of other planets, most notably Imram, the site of several skirmishes between Republic and Hutt forces during the Kaimudon era, and Draktu, which was renowned for having the worst food in the galaxy. The Lannic also controlled the Lannic Wilds, an adjacent, stellar-poor sector with few inhabited worlds. The only notable ones were Ord Dykol, a former Republic military outpost, and Lerisen, homeworld of the Lerisai, a species that, at least in some periods of their history, were at odds with the nearby Bothans. Between the Gamor Run and the Askar Trace was a small slice of less populous space with several worlds of note, some of them under Bothan or Foline influence. There was Lomabu III, the oceanic homeworld of the Lomboans, as well as Makeb, a resource-rich planet that was the site of a three-way battle between the forces of the Hutt Cartel, the Galactic Republic, and the Sith Empire during the Galactic War. A few other worlds here hosted notable sentient species, including Dressel on the Askar Trace, the temperate homeworld of the Dresselians, Benjarin, homeworld of the Carthusians, and Sansa, an industrial world that was home to the Krish. Ongari 9 and the Ividal sector was a major Hephridium mine, while Lawrence was home to a theocracy known as the Order of the Fib that controlled much of the Slew sector. And while it wasn't relevant during the Clone Wars, Nuli and the surrounding Nulian sector was home to a major separatist holdout composed of Aquilish and Harch raiders during the early years of the Empire, prompting an imperial invasion of the sector during the 18 BBY Nulian crisis. To the south of both the Nulian sector and the Lannic worlds was Bothan Space, the territory of the Bothans. Unlike Lannic Space, which was a Republic sector, Bothan Space was an allied region ruled by the Bothan Council, composed of the representatives of hundreds of Bothan clans. Bothan Space contained about 150 Bothan colony worlds, which the Bothans' strong border defenses kept insulated from the troubles of the outside galaxy. But though the Bothans were sure to keep outside influence out of their home turf, the Bothans' influence wasn't limited to Bothan Space. They were one of the Mid-Rim's most powerful civilizations, and they had influence all throughout the outer slice, as we discussed earlier. The Bothans' most famous institution, the Bothan Spynet, had influence and intelligence gathering capabilities all across the galaxy. The heart of Bothan Space and the home of the Bothan Spynet was Bothawui, the Bothan homeworld. Bothawoi was a pleasant, advanced world, sporting both wide, unspoiled country and industrial urban centers. It lay at the crossroads of the Bothan Run, the Kaga Run, and the Rena trade route, making it a natural regional hub. Bothawoi's economic and political power was vast, making it easily the most important planet in the southern mid-rim. But Bothan space contained more planets than just Bothawoi. A few planets in Bothan space had species of their own. These Bothan client species included the Tiny of the Ditini, the Krantians of Krant, and the Vecnoids of Munus Mandel. Most planets in Bothan space were Bothan colonies, however. The most prominent of these was Kothlis, a major manufacturing hub and the second home of the Bothan Spynet, but there was also the industrial colony of Sanat and the lesser colonies of Thoran, Mandel, and Toralis. Also located in Bothan space was the forest planet Krant, an early flashpoint of the Clone Wars. Its moon, Aeryn, hosted a secret Trade Federation mining base. The sectors rimward of Bothan space were largely empty. This was a no-man's land between the Bothans and the Hutts, where the only planets of note were the remote mining world Argovia and Dolban, homeworld of the Gineos, which was located on the Kaga Run. Things were a bit more lively along the southern leg of the Bothan Run, which met the Manda merchant route at Manda near the edge of the Outer Rim. Manda was a booming trade world, the hub of virtually all shipping in the southern slice, as well as the home of the famous Baobab merchant fleet. Manda shared a sector with Helles, a major mining world on the Bothan Run, Deniskar on the Manda merchant route, home to a secret CNF fleet systems facility, and Tenek, the homeworld of a number of weird pests that caused major problems when they were allowed to spread off-world, leading to a quarantine system. From Manda, the Manda merchant route led east to the Outer Rim and west back to the Corellian Run. The next major stop to the west was Lerator, the junction between the merchant routes and the Askar Trace. Lerator had an indigenous sentient species, the Solvix, crustaceans who lived on the continental shelves of their homeworlds and practiced subsistence aquaculture. But the planet was also colonized at some point by humans who set up agricultural communities and strip mines to take advantage of the planet's great mineral wealth. This led to a number of wars between the colonists and the Solvix, though these were mostly small scale, since the two peoples inhabited different parts of the planet. Lerator was the western edge of a densely populated region bordering Bothan space to the west, between the Bothan border and the Askar Trace. Other noteworthy worlds in this region were Regalius, the homeworld of the Rygat, Malthor, a trade world with a large Rygat population, Iridia, a lifeless moon, strip mined by the Republic, Lanos, a flashpoint of the Clone Wars, and Likasha, the homeworld of the Likash. The peaceful planet Nexus Ortai lay where the Askar Trace intersected the Rena trade route, giving it considerable strategic importance. Nexus Ortai lay at the heart of the Herte sector, one of the region's population centers, which also contained Mastera, a former Republic ordnance and regional depot. Past Nexus Ortai, the Rena trade route led through the Hassarian sector, a fairly diverse region all things considered. The sector got its name from the Hassarians of Hassaria, one of the two species indigenous to the sector, the other being the aquatic Nejma of the water world Eriscot. The sector's most well-known planet was Monastery on the Rena trade route. This ringed world was owned by the Order of the Sacred Circle, who used the planet as a cloistered retreat, pondering the higher mysteries in this breathtaking planet's vast rainforests. Also located in the sector was Orsis, a little-known jungle world home to the Orsis Academy, where assassins, spies, and hunters were trained. The Rena trade route's path through this sector was mirrored further by the Manda merchant route, which ran through the neighboring Zanz sector. This sector was sparsely populated, notable only for a pair of mining planets, Anik and the Cortosis-laden Katanos 7. The sectors between the Manda merchant route and the Corellian Run were sparsely populated, but they contained a surprising amount of noteworthy planets. Filv, the desert homeworld of the Filvians, was a notable starport and the home of branch offices for Siena, Blastech, the Trade Federation, and many other wealthy corporations. There was Lastbane, a forest world home to the bizarre Lastby/Hook species, members of which started life as diminutive, friendly Lastbys before maturing into much larger, more aggressive Hooks. Blengil was a knockoff Arrakis, complete with dollar store sandworms called Sand Burrowers. Womric was a beautiful tourist trap. Algarian was an unpleasant world in the grip of an extremely intrusive bureaucracy, and there were also two former Republic regional depots, Ord Segra and the ore-rich Ord Padron. In the far southeastern corner of the Mid-Rim was the Trans-Nebula sector, named after the Vestor Nebula, which dominated most of the sector and contained the Vestor Pulsar. This hard-to-navigate nebula contained the Balin Cluster, as well as Goroth Prime, a wasteland that, despite its harsh conditions, gave rise to the sentient Gorothites. The Trans-Nebula sector also contained the Rhodian colony of Utendic and the three worlds of the Iskalon system. These were Gamandar, home of the near-human Gamandars, Telfrey, home of the Telfreyans, and the ocean planet Iskalon, home to 17 aquatic species who had been relocated from their original homeworlds 5,000 years before the Clone Wars, where they adopted a united identity as Iskalonians. At long last, we come to the Mid-Rim portion of the Corellian Run. The Corwood Corellian Run sectors were home to yet another highly influential species, the Feline, who were another power player in the southern Mid-Rim. The Feline were hardy, long-lived semi-aquatic reptilians known for their powerful pheromones, which they could use to seduce or manipulate beings of other species, something the Feline used to amass considerable political influence. Their homeworld, Feline, was located just off the Corellian Run in the Dolda sector, a jungle world ruled by a hereditary monarchy. Feline was also a regional industrial hub, further increasing the influence of its people. Unlike the Bothans and the Lanix, the Feline didn't directly control a particular swath of space apart from their home system, but they did have influence over other species from this part of the Corellian Run, which included the Frothli of Frothful and the Andulians of Andulia. Notable worlds along the Corellian Run itself included Cabre, which was orbited by Cabre Station, a meeting place for diplomats from all over the galaxy, New Cove, a jungle world so hostile that Covey settlers were forced to build biodomes over their cities to keep the wildlife out, and Druckenwell, a heavily urbanized stronghold of the Trade Federation, which was located at the intersection of the Corellian Run and the Rena trade route. New Cove and Druckenwell were both power plays in local trade. New Cove was home to several powerful corporations that used the planet's aggressive wildlife to harvest biological compounds that couldn't be synthesized. Druckenwell, meanwhile, was run by a corporate oligarchy that oversaw countless factories across the planet, the most famous of which belonged to Blastech. Between Druckenwell and Cabre, the Corellian Run crossed the eastern edge of Pakrapori, a wealthy allied region mostly located in the trailing sectors, renowned for its traders and fiercely independent culture. The rimward part of the mid-rim leg of the Corellian Run crossed through the Lambda sector, the slice portion of which was dominated by the Aqualish. A few decades before the Clone Wars, this part of space had been the site of the Andoan Wars, a brutal conflict between the Spivarelda, which was the main Aqualish government, and the Andoan Free Colonies, an alliance of rebellious Aqualish worlds that sought independence from the Spivarelda's repressive rule. The Andoan Wars saw the legendary Harch Admiral Trench lead the Spivarelda's forces to victory after victory before the Republic intervened on the Free Colonies' behalf and demilitarized the Spivarelda. Despite this, the Spivarelda remained powerful through to the time of the Clone Wars. Ruling from Ando, the Aqualish homeworld, the Spivarelda controlled a whole subsector of the Lambda sector, and it was one of the most powerful governments in the southern mid-rim, despite its historical instability. Its capital, Ando, was an ocean world on the Manda merchant route, dotted with occasional islands, which the Aqualish had heavily developed by the time of the Clone Wars. The Aqualish were the dominant species of both the Spivarelda and the Andoan Free Colonies, notoriously aggressive and brutal. Despite their thuggish reputation, however, they made Ando into a regional economic hub, which was helped by its proximity to the Corellian Run. Colonies ruled by the Spivarelda included two other worlds of the Ando system, Andando and Ando Prime. Andando had been rendered uninhabitable in one of the Aqualish's civil wars and stripped of all usable resources, while Ando Prime, a barely hospitable icy planet, became a major pod racing hub. The Spivarelda grew to control many other colonies and other systems, the most powerful of which was Secundus Ando, the homeworld of the spider-like Harch, who were distant relatives of the Aqualish. Secundus Ando was ruled by the Harsh Ruling Nests, who were the only known non-Aquilish members of the Spivirelda. The Harch and the Aquilish seem to have shared power well, enough that the Harch remained loyal to the Spivirelda against the Free Colonies during the Andoan Wars. The Andoan Free Colonies, meanwhile, were a collection of 15 Aquilish colonies whose shared government was notably less repressive and more republic-friendly than the Spivirelda. The capital of the Free Colonies was Andosha II, the wealthiest and most influential Aquilish colony due to its location on the Corellian Run. Other free colonies included Arbula, Horos, and Rakwish, the latter of which was the site of the Battle of Rakwish, the last battle of the Andoan Wars, where Admiral Trench brutally crushed the forces of the free colonies, leading to Republic intervention. Not all of the Lambda sector was Aquilish territory, however. One of the most infamous Lambda sector worlds was Mon Gaza, located at the intersection of the Manda Merchant Route and the Corellian Run. Mon Gaza was a barren world of red sand deserts, windswept mountains, and vast decaying urban zones, violent and extremely poor despite its status as a major mid-rim trade world. Mon Gaza was one of the most productive spice mining worlds in the galaxy, second only to Kessel, and it was controlled by the Galactic Spice Mining Guild. It was also an infamous shadow port and pod racing hub, and though it did see the occasional legitimate trade now and again, most bases wrote Mon Gaza off as a lawless world, more suited to the outer rim than the mid-rim. Also in the Lambda sector were Thape on the Manda Merchant Route, the ancient homeworld of the Order of Daibendu, precursor to the Order, and Algaro II, the homeworld of the Zan. Past Mon Gaza, the Corellian Run travelled through two more sectors, which contained our last few noteworthy worlds for the mid-rim. There was Hadessa, a wealthy, peaceful world on the Corellian Run, home to a colony of humans and Zeltrons, Ragnar III, the forested homeworld of the Wookiee-like Yuzem, Radnor and Avon, twin worlds and minor manufacturing hubs whose indigenous species were often at odds with one another, the Rhodian colony of Usek, a notorious bounty hunter training ground, and Daima, home to both human and Rhodian colonies. Apart from a small piece of the Medosian sector that was located in 4th Army territory, all of this part of the mid-rim was within the oversector of the 13th Army, whose headquarters, Ord Padron, was located in the mid-rim's southeastern corner. Most of this region remained under Republic control, but it also contained part of the Confederacy's enclave on the Corellian Run, which included some of the very first separatist worlds. Originally, the portion of this enclave within the slice portion of the mid-rim consisted of Likasha, Zan, Herte, Hasterian, Doldor, Cherba, and Corwellian sectors, together with Pakwapori and parts of the Eucralis and Lambda sectors. Many of the systems in these sectors seceded voluntarily over grievances with the Republic, while others were conquered in early separatist offensives, as was the case for Nexus Ortai and Foline. There were also systems within this enclave that remained loyal to the Republic, most notably the Andoan Free Colonies, leading to a long and bloody conflict in the southern mid-rim early in the war. Both sides had strongholds in the southern mid-rim. Apart from Ord Padron, the Republic kept a tight grip on Manda and Lannik, giving it a series of strong positions along the Bothan Run. The Bothans themselves were neutral despite repeated separatist attacks on Bothan space and insisted on spying for both sides. On the other hand, many of the separatist worlds in the southern mid-rim were fiercely loyal to the Confederacy, particularly Ando and the other Spivirelda worlds, which kept fighting even after the Republic reconquered them. Ando was a major political stronghold of the Confederacy, while Mon Gaza, Druckenwell, and New Kov were all major economic strongholds, with Druckenwell in particular hosting munitions factories for the Droid army. The Corellian Run portion of separatist space was particularly volatile, in large part because the Clone Wars saw a second round of Andoan Wars erupt in the Lambda sector. This conflict was just as bloody as the first, as while the Spivirelda and Free Colonies did much of the fighting, both received reinforcements from their respective galactic governments. Andoan space wasn't the only part of the southern mid-rim to see extensive fighting either. Krent, in Bothan space, was the site of one of the first major battles of the war, and early in, the separatist forces based on the Corellian Run attacked nearby loyalist mid-rim sectors frequently, attempting to expand separatist control in the southern mid-rim as much as possible. Some of these were thwarted by Republic forces. Other separatist campaigns saw much more success. General Grievous cut a swath through the southern mid-rim not long after the Battle of Christosis, subjugating Lanos and encroaching on Bothan space, where Grievous battled Anakin Skywalker's fleet in the Rings of Golm, a gas giant in the Bothaway system. Kothlis, another Bothan stronghold, came under Separatist attack not once, but twice. But the 13th Army, thanks to extensive reinforcement from the 4th Army, was able to reverse most of the Separatists' early gains in the southern mid-rim, and in 21 BBY, the tide of the war in this theatre began to shift. Republic forces advancing down the Corellian Run began to push into the Separatists' enclave on the route. Slowly but surely, the Republic reclaimed the Separatist sectors along the Corellian Run. The conflict in the Lambda sector ended with the eventual defeat of the Spivarelda and the Republic capture of Ando. By the start of the Outer Rim sieges, in 20 BBY, Republic forces had completely retaken the Corellian Run, driving what remained of CIS forces in the region back to the Outer Rim. Next up, we have Hutt Space, which straddled the boundary between the Mid and Outer Rims. This region became widely charted by the Republic between 15,000 and 8,000 BBY, but it had been thoroughly explored and settled by the Hutts for millennia before. Some regions of Hutt Space had been under Hutt control since before the Republic, or were conquered in the days of the Hutt Empire. Others were newer annexations, vassals brought in after the rise of the Hutt cartel. All of it was under the complete control of the Hutts, however, and it had been for as long as anyone could remember. Some regions of Hutt Space were home to other developed civilizations with small portions of territory, but they were all Hutt vassals and ultimately answered to Nal Hutta. The Republic had no presence in Hutt Space, with only one small exception. Hutt Space was defined by 3 major hyperspace routes. These were the Utmian Pabol, or Outlanders Road, which connected Hutt Space to the Republic, the Shag Pabol, or Slave Road, which was the economic backbone of Hutt Space, and the Pabol Hutta, or Glorious Road, which led through the core of Hutt territory. These 3 routes converged at the Yutub system, home to Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa, the capital worlds of the Hutts. The Hutts evolved on the planet Val on the Pabol Hutta, but as you know if you've watched our Hutt history video, the Val system was destroyed during the Hutt cataclysms of 15,000 BBY, rendering Val a barren, airless wasteland. Hutt fleets prevented outsiders from visiting the system, and the Hutts themselves long ago relocated to Nal Hutta in the Yutub system, which became their new capital. Originally a lush forest world called Evokar, the Hutts transformed Nal Hutta into a bloated, stagnant swamp, which they dotted with gaudy pleasure palaces and poorly maintained industrial plants, which leaked toxic waste into the swamps. Nal Hutta's largest moon, Nar Shaddaa, was transformed into a city world to rival Coruscant, covered by layer upon layer of skyscraper blocks and industrial zones. Nar Shaddaa was the most populous world in Hutt Space and the economic heart of the region, and though it had once been a legitimate port, after the Kai's supernova severed the original Utmian Pabol in 4000 BBY, it became an infamous shadow port known far and wide as the Smuggler's Moon. By the time of the Clone Wars, Nar Shaddaa was a giant slum, public capital of sorts for the Hutts, which they used as a buffer of sorts between traffic from the Republic and Nal Hutta. Also located on the Pabol Hutta was the volcanic planet Slaheiron, the warforge of the Hutts, a major trade world and industrial hub. Slaheiron was one of the Hutts' oldest colonies, and as an economic power player, it was second only to Nar Shaddaa. Between these 2 titans of Hutt trade were the most ancient conquests of the Hutt Empire, a swath of space that had been consistently under Hutt control since before the Republic. The most prominent of these territories was the region known as the Butana Hutta, the Garden of the Hutts. The Hutt clans forbade all outsiders from entering Butana Hutta without express permission, and as a result, this region was a mystery to most of the galaxy. It was heavily fortified, and competition between Hutt clans was forbidden within the region's borders. Butana Hutta contained the private throne worlds of the Hutt clans, each designated with the prefix Kor, as in Kor Deselagic, Kor Basadi, and Kor Angeliak. The Pabol Hutta led through the heart of the Butana Hutta, but outsiders traveling the route were stopped at the region's borders and rerouted elsewhere. The 2 main entry points into the Butana Hutta were Mulatan and Gos Hutta. Both of these systems swarmed with Hutt warships, a rare sight elsewhere, and outsiders that attempted to pass them would be interdicted and killed. Most of the charted systems in Butana Hutta were clan throne worlds, but not all of them. Other worlds in the region included Pybus, which was covered in strange ruins and considered taboo by the Hutts, while Nar Chuna and Butana Shagplan were both highly exclusive market worlds where exotic slaves and artifacts worth more than whole sectors were bought and sold. There were also Haloon and Languna, both home to former slave species that had displeased the Hutts and been all but wiped out for it, with their homeworlds turned into nature preserves for the Hutts to go on safaris. The Butana Hutta also contains Saki, the homeworld of the Sakians, whom the Hutts mostly left alone. The Sakians were also given lordship over several adjacent colonies, those being Sakidopa, Sakiduba, and Sakifwana. Many of the systems in the Butana Hutta were lush and beautiful, but the regions immediately adjacent to the Butana Hutta were largely desolate. Chunks of territory deep in Hutt Space were almost completely depopulated by the depredations of the ancient Hutt Empire, the most infamous of which was the region due east of the Butana Hutta, the Cairns. A little used route called the Dead Road wound its way through here, connecting a string of lifeless planets that had been plundered by the Hutts long ago. Mhana, Tisht, Sakar, Usk, and Moralan were all examples of depopulated systems in the Cairns. The history of some of these worlds was widely known, while others were a complete mystery. This region also contained a few backwater trade worlds, most notably Elgit and Nar Huskar, which were rarely visited. At the minor trade world Ulmatra, the Dead Road crossed the Pabel Slaheron, another major hyperspace route that had once been the northern edge of the Hutt Empire. North of this route was a string of major industrial worlds and the homes of prominent slave species. Species from this region included the Cyborians of Cyboria, known for their strength and prowess in battle, the near-human Scups of Sionia, and the Nimbanels of Nimban, infamous for being the only species to leave the Republic to serve the Hutts voluntarily, for which they were rewarded with a high place in the Hutt hierarchy. Other noteworthy worlds in this part of Hutt Space were the agri-world of Kfane, the industrial world of Dirha, and the trade world of Narkrita. The northern tip of Hutt Space, at least during the time of the Empire, was the Siklata cluster. The Hutts restricted outsider access to this region, only allowing outsiders to visit the minor trade world of Nemia on the cluster's outskirts. That was because the Siklata cluster contained the homeworlds of three of the Hutts' most important slave species, who the Hutts deliberately kept isolated: the Klatunians of Klatooine, the Vodrans of Vodran, and the Niktos of Kintan. These species were enslaved by the Hutts before the dawn of the Republic and used en masse as slave soldiers to win the Third Battle of Vontor, planet also included in the Siklata cluster. During the time of the Empire, the Siklata cluster was the northernmost tip of Hutt Space. Historically, however, the territory of the Hutts extended all the way to Bunta. Between Bunta and the Siklata was a region known as the Periphery, which contained Shrilo, the homeworld of the Weakways. The Periphery also contained Vathkri, the homeworld of the Vathkri, a race of sentient rock formations, Sedri, homeworld of the aquatic Sedrians, the trade world Lant, and Af-El, the homeworld of the Defel, shadowy beings that were hard to see with the naked eye. Adjacent to the Periphery was the Iotran Expanse, centered around Iotra, an independent state known for its disciplined and regimented populace. During the days of the Old Republic, Hutt Space also included the spice mining planet Kessel, which we'll discuss in another section, as well as the Cretan Narrows, which is that weird gap in the northwest part of the region. Most of the other parts of Hutt Space were essentially petty fiefdoms run by favoured Hutt vassal species, which were allowed some degree of independence so long as they paid tribute to Nal Hutta. This was especially true for the mid-rim section of Hutt Space. In the northwest, you had the Elosians, who controlled many of the Elosian spur worlds, particularly Ilos, Ilos Minor, and Talnami. There were also the Vipit of Ali, known for their crafty lawyers. Closer to Nal Hutta, on the edge of the Octos Nebula, you had Toydaria and Jilrua, home to the Toydarians and Jilruans respectively. Toydaria was a swamp world and its indigenous sentients were known for their shrewdness and tempers, while Jilrua was a desert world and the Jilruans were best known for their bladed weapons. The Corwood part of Hutt Space also contained the Utmian Pobol, which was dotted with minor ports and industrial worlds, among them the urban planet Irith and the Hutt leisure world of Du Hutta. Where the Utmian Pobol crossed the border between Hutt Space and the Republic, the Hutts established Quen Space Station as a clearinghouse for goods heading into Hutt Space. The southern part of Hutt Space was similar to the western part. Several recently annexed Hutt vassals were located here, including the Yak Tosh of Zolu, who controlled the Pando Spur, and Tisk, the home of the Tisken. The Holliston Run was the major hyperspace route through this region, connecting Hutt Space to the infamous shadow port at Cyverus. The trade world Holliston, which gave this route its name, was one of many trade worlds in this region. Others included Nar Kagar and Afavan. The Holliston run ended at Circumtor, the home of the Shell Hutts, an insular, obscure clan of Hutt warriors that rejected the reforms the other Hutts adopted after the Hutt cataclysms. Other notable worlds in the south were Hosko on the Pabul Hutta, a Hutt agri-world, Nar Kagar, a minor trade world home to lower caste Hutts and a few Shell Hutt clans, and Ryleb, the only planet in Hutt Space to remain fully independent of Hutt rule, much to the displeasure of the Hutts. Lastly, we have the worlds of the Shag Pabol, a corridor of miserable slave worlds and spice mines. The most important planets along this route were Rorak 5, home to Hutt Space's largest slave market, the industrial hellhole Dayu, and the spice production colony of Yelesia. The Shag Pabol was the industrial backbone of Hutt Space, but for obvious reasons, it was also rarely visited willingly. Hutt Space was neutral territory in the Clone Wars for the most part, but the Hutts didn't sit out the war completely, and the region was ultimately affected by the war in a number of ways. Over the course of the conflict, the Republic and the Confederacy both tried to win the Hutts' favor, and both sides made agreements with various clans to gain access to Hutt-controlled hyperspace routes. Early in the war, the Separatists kidnapped Jabba the Hutt's son, Rota, and attempted to frame the Jedi to turn the Hutts against the Republic, only for the plot to backfire when the truth of the matter was revealed. In retaliation, the Hutt Council gave the Republic access to hyperspace routes through Hutt Space, which gave the Republic a major advantage in the war in the slice, giving them alternate routes to attack Separatist space along in the Felucia Theater. The Hutts didn't exclusively deal with the Republic, however. Though Clan Desilajik gave the Republic preferential treatment due to the kidnapping of Rota, their rivals, Clan Basadi, often defied the ruling council to work with the Separatists. In addition, in 20 BBY, the Hutt cartel was briefly roped into Darth Maul's Shadow Collective, though they left at the first possible opportunity. The Republic considered Hutt Space to be within the territory of Iron Lance Command, the 13th Sector Army, though this was mostly a formality. While Iron Lance Command and other Republic sector armies made use of the Hutts' hyperspace routes after the Battle of Teth, there was only one permanent Republic installation within the borders of Hutt Space, a military base on Toydaria established with the permission of the Toydarian King Katunko in 21 BBY. At long last, we come to the fringe of the slice, the Outer Rim. Unlike in every other region of the galaxy, settlement of the Outer Rim actually happened at a snail's pace in the slice, mostly due to the overbearing influence of the Hutts and other criminal gangs that thrived in this remote region. Some parts of the Outer Rim had been part of the Republic for tens of thousands of years. The Tion cluster and its surrounds were brought into the Republic back when the Inner Rim was still considered the frontier. But it wasn't until 10,000 BBY that the Republic started exploring most of the Outer Rim, and it wasn't until 5,000 BBY that settlement began in the slice portion of the region. Some of the sectors we'll be discussing today were still considered wild space even in the time of the Clone Wars. Apart from the Polemian trade route and the Corellian run, the most important hyperspace route in the Outer Rim was the treeless trade route. This route started at Centaurus in the mid-rim and formed a wide loop around the rimward end of Hutt Space, going all the way through the slice before crossing the Corellian run at Arcanis. In the southern Outer Rim, all other major routes linked up with the Hutt Highway, as it was sometimes called. The Merchant Run emptied into the route at Molivar, and rimward of Hutt Space, the Holliston Run, Shag Pabol and Pabol Slaheron met the treeless at Sivaris, Teth and Formos, respectively. North of Hutt Space, the Lesser Lentilian route crossed the treeless at the Junkfoot Station on its way to Oceon, while the Salin Corridor crossed at Cymirth on its way to Bunta. Only two major routes in this part of the slice weren't tributaries of the Trelius. The Overic Grip Link, which branched off the Polemian at Querma and struck out to Mon Calamari, and the Cadinth Run, another Polemian branch that ran through the heart of the Tion cluster. As with the Mid-Rim, we're going to be doing the Outer Rim in two parts, beginning with the Tion cluster and its neighbours, and following with the periphery of Hutt Space. By far the most important part of the northern Outer Rim was the Tion cluster, so we're going to start our tour of the region here. The history of the Tion is worth a video of its own, but for now we'll give you the short version. The Tion cluster was settled thousands of years before the time of the Republic by the crews of a pair of wayward sleeper ships sent out from Coruscant. In isolation from their brethren in the core, these humans developed their own unique civilization in the distant reaches of the Outer Rim, reverse engineering Ricardan technology to build primitive hyperdrives, beam tubes, and war droids. These Tionies spread out across the Tion cluster where they built a number of thriving civilizations. In the centuries between the fall of the Rakata and the rise of the Republic, the Tion cluster became the heart of two great empires. The first was built by the pirate king Xur VIII, who conquered the kingdom of Kron and its neighbors, taking over all the cluster except the Livian League in the northwest. But Xur's son, known to history as Zim the Despot, far surpassed him. Zim not only conquered the Livian League, but a vast region of space around the Tion cluster, building a vast empire that was, for a brief period, the largest in the galaxy. But the Tionies would have their glory days cut short by the Hutt Empire, which defeated Zim and destroyed his empire. The much-reduced Tionies empire splintered into warring kingdoms, which quickly destroyed what wealth and power the Hutts had allowed them to retain. When the Republic made contact with the Tion cluster during the blazing of the Polemian trade route early in its history, the region was a shadow of its former self. But the Tionies still remembered their glory days, and they saw the idealistic Republic as ripe for the plundering, a way to return the Tion cluster to the wealth and power it had once enjoyed. The largest of the Tionies' successor states, the Honorable Union of Decivero and Tion, fought a 100-year war with the Young Republic, the first war the Republic had ever faced. But the Tionies' war ended up in a Republic victory, and following it, the Tion cluster was subjugated and incorporated into the Republic. For many thousands of years, it was the Republic's sole outpost in the Outer Rim, a remote region that had been immiserated even further by its defeat in the Tionies' war. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Tion cluster had lost most of its wealth and prestige, but it was still a historically significant region, well populated and, in some parts, still fairly well off. The Tionies were also very influential in local politics, as their ancestors had enslaved or wiped out most of the neighboring non-human species they discovered, leaving their heirs with few potential rivals. The map you're currently seeing is a map of the Greater Tion. The Tion cluster and its Tionies dominated neighbor sectors as it was organized by the Empire. During the Clone Wars, however, the map looked a little different. The Colonies mandate was still called by its ancient name, the Kingdom of Kron, and the Tion hegemony was much larger, containing the sectors the Empire named Allied Tion, Indrexu Sector, and Keldrath Sector. The Empire divided up the hegemony and renamed the Kingdom of Kron in retaliation for the two sectors' strong commitment to the separatist cause during the Clone Wars. We're going to be covering all of the Greater Tion sectors except the Thanium worlds, since those were in the Transhidian instead of the Slice, and we're going to start with the Cronies Mandate, known during the Clone Wars as the Kingdom of Kron. It contained a total of 464 inhabited worlds, much more than the other Tion cluster sectors, which only contained 136 combined. The Polemian trade route passed through the Cronies Mandate, but the main routes here were the Greater and Lesser Cronies arcs, the backbone of the ancient Kingdom of Kron. The Greater Cronies arc met the Polemian at the bustling trade world Arkan 4, the Cronies Mandate's primary spaceport, past which the Greater Cronies arc struck out east past the sector's principal worlds. The sector capital was Chandar, the ancient throne world of the original Kingdom of Kron and the second throne of Zim, once called the Jewel of Tion. This city planet was still ruined by the kings of Kron, but by the Clone Wars, it was a polluted world of decaying urban zones, mostly owned by mining companies, a shadow of its former self. Janalis 7, one of the very first tiny settlements, had fared similarly, being a poor world whose large population depended on a subsistence economy. Other historically significant worlds were better preserved. The ruins of Zim's fabled Forbidden Gardens still remained on Nuswata. Dunar Bulon, the homeworld of Zim's feared Star Lancers, endured as an unspoiled pastoral world, and Saurus, a world renowned in Zim's time for its gladiatorial combat, still held fights in its arenas during the Clone Wars. But though the Cronies Mandate was known for its history, that wasn't what made it the most prominent sector in the Tion cluster. That honor actually went to its mining worlds, the chief of which were windswept Kismano and Gardon 3, as well as its agri-worlds, including Darillium, which lay where the Cronies arcs intersected the Indrexu route, and Pasmin, famed for its textiles. Of course, in keeping with its history, the Colonies mandate was also full of notorious pirate worlds. Argai, the homeworld and first throne of Zur and Zim, was still a pirate's haunt, as were Algor, the ruined shipyards of Barankar, and the ocean world of Korlas. Aramanx and Or-7, both formerly productive urban industrial worlds, were ruined worlds little better than slums by the time of the Clone Wars. The Imperial Allied Tion sector covered parts of the ancient kingdom of Barseg and the Jamanir Marches. This sector was the core of the Tion cluster, dominated by the Polemian trade route and the Cadinth Run, the latter of which was the backbone of the sector. The two routes met at Liana, a thriving spaceport and industrial world known as the headquarters of CNR Fleet Systems. Liana was one of the wealthiest and most notable planets in the Tion, and it was typical of what made the Allied Tion successful: its many industrial worlds. The sector capital was Jamanir, another prominent industrial world, though historically the region was ruled from Cadinth, the third throne of Zim and the center of the Tion cluster, an ancient world that had long since been devastated by industrial activity. Other industrial worlds in the Allied Tion include Korlax 4, a major supplier for the CIS, Lorad, which had formerly been enslaved by its neighbor Barseg, and Desagor, a mining world. Amarin and Dravion were both agri-worlds, while proud Barseg on the Polemian was a grim trade world with a rigid caste system and an arrogance born from its ancient history. The Allied Tion also contained Vos, whose two sentient species, the Vos and the Gormak, were locked in an endless war with one another. The Tion hegemony was informally divided into two regions, separated by the Indrexu Spiral, a dense, impassable tangle of nebulae at the heart of the Tion cluster. These two regions were the proud, moderately wealthy Livian worlds on the west side of the nebulae, and the much poorer, neglected systems of the Black Spiral on the east side. The Livian worlds roughly corresponded to the ancient Livian League, and two of the three founders of the League were shadows of their former selves by the time of the Clone Wars. Livian itself had become an unremarkable agri-world covered in ancient ruins, while Desavro, a city planet on the Polemian that had been Zim's fourth throne, was barely better than a giant slum. Desavro had been the orchestrator of the Tynese War, and as punishment, the Republic had all but sterilized it at the war's end. Desavro had been in ruins for millennia, as it alone of the Tynese worlds refused to join the Republic after the end of the war, leaving it isolated and destroyed. The Desavras eventually caved and joined the Republic, and by the Clone Wars, Desavro had long since been rebuilt, but it was still a polluted, unpleasant shadow of its former self, its people known for their speciesism more than anything else. But Canova, the third founder of the Livian League, was actually doing quite well by the Clone Wars, becoming one of the Far Polemian's dominant trade worlds. Nearby Falende and Oman on the Desavra Trace were agri-worlds that shipped their products to the Far Polemian through Canova's spaceports. Then there was the Black Spiral, knit together by the Tion trade route. The world that gave the Tion cluster its name, Tion was located here, though it was actually a completely unremarkable ocean world. By far the most important system in the Black Spiral was the Raxus system, home to two worlds, Raxus Prime and Raxus Secundus. Raxus Secundus, unlike the other Black Spiral worlds, was a thriving planet with a rich history, home to beautiful seas, forests, and cities alike. Raxus Prime was once similar, a pleasant world dotted with warm lagoons and beautiful palaces, the favoured throne of Zim the Despot. It was known as the Circlet of the Tion and Nikito's Shining Gem, and during earlier eras of Republic history, it had been a wealthy throne world and a booming industrial centre. But millennia of steadily increasing industrial activity had slowly destroyed Raxus Prime, polluting its lagoons and covering the planet with industrial sprawl and junkyards. By the time of the Clone Wars, Raxus Prime was known across the galaxy as a junkyard planet, buried from pole to pole under mountains of scrap, with only a few scattered industrial zones still active. Raxus Secundus fared better, however, and the Clone Wars brought both planets another major role in galactic history. Raxus Prime was where Dooku issued the fiery Raxus address to the galaxy, condemning the Republic and declaring the formation of the CIS, while Raxus Secundus served as the Confederacy's capital. On the other end of the Black Spiral was Delalt, a water world that housed the ruins of Zim the Despot's grand treasure vaults, as well as the aquatic Delashian species. 2 former Chinese slave species had their homes in the Black Spiral as well. Saheelandil was home to the furry, industrious Saheelandili, while Brigia was home to the purple-skinned Brigians. Other worlds in the Black Spiral included the minor industrial planet Orion 4, the shipyard world of Clariv, the early Clone Wars Flashpoint Eridan Prime, and Kawan, home to one of Count Dooku's personal fortresses. Rimwood of the Black Spiral were the territories the Empire made into the Indrexu and Keldruth sectors, both hotbeds of piracy and separatism. The Indrexu sector, the name of which invoked the ancient Indrexu Confederacy, contained Shullivane, homeworld of the Emily, and 3 notable worlds along the far Polemian: the sector capital Estaria, a spaceport and trade world, the minor trade world Genodrol Miza, and the manufacturing center Ankh Kishore. The Keldruth sector, which shared its name with the ancient Keldruth alignment, was more or less a backwater, with the only notable worlds being the Commerce Guild mining settlement Eskat, Gabu, the home of the hardy insectoid Vubgri, and Mulan, a peaceful world on the Pukunai Drift that the turbulent history of the greater Tion seemed to have ignored. Now we move back to the rest of the northern outer rim, starting with the Polemian worlds closer to the core. These were part of 5 sectors that during the Separatist Crisis formed a regional confederacy called the Commonality, which was founded and run by the wealthy and influential Greyshade family. On the Polemian itself were the minor industrial world Antimeridias and Colomex, the Commonality's capital and a wealthy trade world. Just off the Polemian was Kiorin, a world where smugglers could semi-retire while acting as bankrollers for younger smugglers, and 2 planets known for their casinos, Galsol and Bragkis. There was also Belderone, a largely unremarkable Salen corridor world that was the site of a major battle during the Outer Rim sieges. Wedged between the Commonality and the Tion cluster was the Auril sector. Once, the Auril sector had been dominated by a tangle of nebulae around the Kron cluster, a knot of 10 beautiful stars in close arrangement. This cluster was surrounded by the 9 Auril systems, the most famous of which was the Adega system, which contained Ossus, the ancient homeworld of the Jedi. For 20,000 years, Ossus had been a beautiful place, a verdant lightside nexus home to the Jedi Council and the Great Jedi Library, the headquarters of the Jedi Order. The Jedi had several space stations in the area, including Chemplex 11 at the Kron cluster itself and Erin Station close by. For millennia, the Jedi made the Auril sector a bastion of peace and prosperity in the Outer Rim. But then, the Great Sith War happened. During that devastating conflict, a Sith superweapon completely destroyed the Kron cluster, causing a massive supernova that obliterated 3 of the 9 Auril systems and scoured the rest. Ossus was ravaged, becoming an arid, barely inhabited wasteland, and it was cut off from the galaxy by the Kron Drift, a massive debris field that impeded hyperspace travel, all that remained of the destroyed systems. Also among the destroyed planets was Urkup, the homeworld of the Deshade. The Jedi were forced to relocate to Coruscant, and the Auril sector declined. By the time of the Clone Wars, its most notable worlds were Mercana, the Corporate Alliance's headquarters, Beldemnik, the homeworld of the Conmi and a rich source of cortosis, and the space city of Nespis 8, which had been established by the Jedi tens of thousands of years before the Clone Wars, before gradually being abandoned. Coreward of Auril sector, the Salen corridor, and Triellus trade route ran through a dense string of industrial worlds that connected the Republic's Polemian territories to Hutt Space, weaving past a few nebulae, the Oryxon Nebula, and the Sundered Veil. The most influential of these worlds was Cymirth, which sat at the junction of the 2 routes. The homeworld of the Cymyrthians, between its industry and its location, Cymirth was quite wealthy, and together with nearby Alaga, the homeworld of the Holwolfs, it was one of the CIS's most important strongholds. Fellow industrial centers in the region included nearby Waskiro, the Tharan sector world Pyrrhic, and the mining planets Simbark and Morjone, the latter also being the homeworld of the Morjoni. Jabim, a major Clone Wars battlefield infamous for its miserable weather and muddy surface, was another mining world located in this region. Handoween, which the Republic used as a staging ground to attack Jabim, was close by, as were the much older Republic staging grounds at Ord Zut and Ord Namurt. Seleucami, a Techno-Union stronghold and major battlefield of the Outer Rim sieges, was located at Sualrup sector in this part of the Outer Rim, close to the borders of Hutt Space. This young, volcanically active planet was originally an obscure, little-visited world with nothing but farms and small cities, but the Techno Union built several secret fortresses there, including the underground clone factory used to produce the Morgukai Shadow Army, leading to a brutal 5-month siege of the planet. On the southern edge of this region was Bunta, a wasteland that the Hutts had once fought a war with the Chinese over, which by the Clone Wars was home to a major spaceport and galaxy-renowned swoop races. A whole slew of sentient species called the nearby sectors home, including the rat-like Chadra fan of Watery Chad, the Puyoi of Kirill's world, the aggressive Hook of Lijutur, the Laboy of Laboy 2, the lizard-like Anudat of Anu, the Rets of Gelifil, the Nalidians of Nalid, and the Tamarians of Tamar. In the rimward reaches of this region were 2 prison colonies, the high-security moon Uvu 4 and the space station Cog Hive 7. Junkfort Station, a noted smuggler's haunt, was located on the edge of the region, as was Garn, the desolate homeworld of the Order of the Terrible Glare, a dark Jedi sect that had split from the Jedi Order to side with the Pios Dea during their crusades. East of this region and due south of the Tion cluster was a vast expanse of space known only as the Ash Worlds. Once, these had been the Kyrium Reaches, lush and wealthy Tinies colonies established by Zim's empire. The Hutts, however, had wiped all these colonies out during the Devouring, a 24,500 BBY campaign of genocide aimed at weakening the Tinies. Every last Tinies in the sector was killed and their worlds were destroyed, rendered desolate and unsuitable for life. The destruction was so complete that it took Republic scholars tens of thousands of years to realize that the legendary Kyrium Reaches and the Ash Worlds were one and the same. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Ash Worlds were still nearly lifeless. Huranom and Astagon, Zim's 2 thrones in the region, were unrecognizable. The former was known to the Republic as Windigal II, and was a pestilent swamp, while the latter had become a barren, completely unusable world that hadn't even been given a name, categorized in Republic archives only as OHS 3842-03. A similar fate awaited the former tiny strongholds of Balshiba, Ulonsas, and Zorais. Only a few systems in this sector, which the Tinies hadn't settled, were left unscathed. The important ones were Bis, home of the Abyssin, Chiron, home of the centaur-like Chironians, and the legendary planet Aigo, the world of 1,000 moons. Located in the heart of the Extracarium Nebula, Aigo was a rogue planet, meaning it didn't have a parent star. Rather, it wandered erratically through the nebula, given light and heat by the surrounding ionized stellar gases. It was a strange place, littered with castaways who had been stranded on the planet after their ships had crashed, and home to 2 semi-mythical species, the subterranean Malibi and the Diathim, or angels, who lived on Aego's largest moon, Milius Prime. The last region of the northern outer rim we have to talk about is the distant sectors along the Overic Griplink and their neighbors to the south. The Overic Griplink branched off the Plemian trade route at Kierma in the Nilligard sector, the mostly pleasant homeworld of the Kiermians, who you might know as Yrel Poof's species. The 4-armed, long-necked Kiermians were actually the results of Arcanian genetic experiments on another species, the Zezto, and they were only one of a few noteworthy species from this region. Just up the Polemian from Kiermia was Makum Te, the arid homeworld of the Swokes, a burly, belligerent species known for their religious zealotry and their pronounced mean streak. 10% of Makum Te's surface was covered by the tract of Makum Te, an unimaginably huge necropolis. Originally mistaken for an ice cap by Republic scouts, the tract contained over 1 trillion plots, one for every Swokes to ever die on Makum Te since the tradition started. And just a short hop down the Overic Griplink from Kierma was Tula, the frigid homeworld of the furry, flat-faced Whippards. Also in the vicinity of the Overic Griplink was Karkaris, an ocean world home to the shark-like Carcharodons, Flawn, the homeworld of the bizarre invertebrate Lamproids, Munto Kodru, home of the 4-armed Kodru G, Ord Bury, an Old Republic outpost, the urban planet Reaper's World, Dronga, a wild space world and the only known source of the healing agent Bota, and Pakuni, an infamous pirate stronghold. The Overic grip link ended in Calamari space at the planet Duck, more commonly known as Mon Calamari. This ocean planet was the homeworld of two regionally significant species, the Mon Calamari and the Quarren. The Mon Calamari, who lived in gleaming cities on the surface and in the shallows, were a people known for their brilliant intellectuals, strategists, and above all, their shipwrights. The Mon Calamari orbital shipyards were some of the most famous and productive in the galaxy, the rival of even the ancient shipyards of the core. The Quarren, meanwhile, lived on the seafloor, and they constantly took ire with their planetary neighbors, who had overshadowed them both literally and figuratively for thousands of years. The Mon Calamari had independently invented the cavitation hyperdrive, which they used to carve out Calamari space in the years before Republic contact. Calamari space was a small federation of worlds originally established as a protective reef of colonies, a breakwater that could act as a buffer to protect Dark. Mon Calamari colonies included Hinaku, Mantan, New Herkia, Rustio, and Crinamonan III. The latter colonies each had orbital shipyards of their own. The Quarren, unwilling to be left behind, established colonies of their own on Buchik, Talas, Mintuin, and Pamant, and shipyards of their own on the latter two worlds. There was precious little due south of Calamari space. A few luckless species had their homeworlds out there, the most important of which were the Gand, a species of highly collectivist insects from Gand, a world with an ammonia atmosphere and a long-standing totalitarian government known for its force-sensitive bounty hunters known as Findsmen. A few others were the Brubs of Barros, the Dornians of Dornia, the Tungs of Tungel, and the Korzubians of Korzubia. There was also the penal colony of Drubila, close to the Ashworlds. The last sector we'll be talking about for the northern outer rim is the Centrality, an allied region that, to paraphrase the Essential Atlas, was ironically named because it was never the center of anything. Not even the Hutts had any interest in it. This mostly empty and extremely remote territory was founded by frontier settlers looking to get away from the corruption of the Republic, and any sort of central government for that matter. A large part of the region was taken up by the open sea, an almost completely empty stellar void that was a certain death sentence to travel through. The capital of the Centrality was Erulnar, while its financial center was Delo III, the homeworld of the Ularins. Most of the region's food came from the agri-world Dilonexia 23, while most manufacturing was done on Rigneldia 2. The Centrality's joint naval forces maintained shipyards at Silal and a secret base on Hosrel 11, while the sector's most popular destination was Oseon, an asteroid field known for its casinos and beautiful light shows. The Centrality also contained a number of oddities, some of which had ancient history. Yuayua was home to the bird-like Kwasav, while the remote planet Tund was home to the sorcerers of Tund, the descendants of the Sith pureblood heretics that had been exiled from the original Sith Empire. Rafa 5 and all the other planets in its system were covered in massive indestructible plastic pyramids built by the Sharu, an ancient pre-Republic civilization. They had ruled this part of the galaxy in the days of the Celestials, before the rise of the Infinite Empire drove them to revert to a primitive state for fear of attracting the attention of the Rakata. Lastly, there was the legendary star cave of Thonboka, a nebula deep in the open sea that contained the nesting ground of the Oswaft, a legendary species of space-dwelling mantas that could travel through hyperspace. All of this region fell within the territory of the 12th Sector Army, but there was virtually no Republic-controlled space in this part of the Outer Rim, with the only exceptions being parts of Calamari space, Liana and the Tion cluster, and, briefly, Handaween. The CIS, on the other hand, had lots of territory out here, including some of its most important strongholds. Separatist space included the Antimeridian, Meridian, Vorzid, Belderone, Auril, Jospro, Felim, Pakunai, and Nilgard sectors in their entirety, as well as the entire Greater Tion, part of the Ashworlds, and parts of the Sual Reap and Tharin sectors. The Tion cluster was a major political and economic stronghold of the CIS, representing part of the foundry of the Confederacy, which also extended into other parts of this region. The separatist capital, Raxus Secundus, was located in the Tion hegemony, and the whole Tion cluster was packed with separatist strongholds. Particularly important to the Confederacy were the industrial worlds Lorad, Korlax IV, Jaminir, and Raxus Prime. Delalt and Cowan served as important command bases as well. Strongholds in the rest of the foundry of the Confederacy included the industrial worlds Mokana and Simirth, the political stronghold Aliga, and Seleucami, a techno-union redoubt. Aigo in the Ash Worlds was also converted into a last-ditch redoubt for the Separatist Council, while many of the Quarren colonies in Calamari space, particularly Pamant and Mintoween, built capital ships for the Confederacy. The Republic only made a few forays into this region for most of the Clone Wars, and most of these ended in disaster, as with the Battle of Jabim. It was able to help them on Calamari stave off Quarren attempts at seizing control of Calamari space and seceding, but that was about it. But that all changed at the end of the war with the advent of the Outer Rim sieges. In 19 BBY, Republic forces were able to finally gain some ground in this region, which was dubbed the Felucia Theatre. Ossus, Seleucami, Mokana, and Pamant were all the sites of key sieges. Belderon was the site of a major battle as well, while the native Konmi of Baldemnik waged war against both loyalist and separatist forces, successfully driving both from their homeworld. Makam Tay and Tula also came under attack from Republic forces during the war's final days. Last of all, let's talk about the southern portion of the Outer Rim, starting with the region toward the bottom, around the intersection of the Corellian Run and the Trielis. The run itself passed through the Savarine and Arcanis sectors before heading out into less familiar territory, while the Trielis passed through Arcanis to the Groll sector. The Savarine sector was a fairly colourful region that was split in half by the Corellian Run. The Slice side was home to one of the galaxy's most well-known species, the Rhodians of Rhodia, who were one of the only civilizations in this part of the Outer Rim that weren't dominated by the Hutts. Rhodia, as you may know, was a world of swamps and rainforests, dotted with domed cities and sprawling, disorganized industrial zones. Its native Rhodians were hunters who organized themselves into clans, which often fought bloody civil wars with each other. The leader of the dominant clan became the Grand Protector of Rhodia, essentially a dictator. Despite their violent ways, however, the Rhodians were fairly prominent in galactic politics, and their homeworld's three big exports, bounty hunters, industrial goods, and theater troops, gave Rhodia considerable economic power in the region. The Rhodians had several colonies in the southern slice. We mentioned a few of them while talking about the Mid-Rim, and in the Outer Rim, they also maintained the colonies of Utamoik and Utarun in the neighbouring Arcanis sector. Christosis sat along the Corellian Run just past where the route entered the Outer Rim. This highly unusual world was largely composed of brilliant blue crystals, and it was one of many mining worlds in the Savarine sector, with others being Apatros and Zadja, the former a dismal Cortosis mine, and the latter a snowy world home to a Genosian droid factory. Christosis was much more important and wealthier than either of these worlds, however. Not only did the planet, or at least its mercantile oligarchy, profit immensely from its own crystal resources, but the Christosis system also boasted 3 dense belts of metal-rich asteroids, which the Christopsians also mined. Christosis also controlled trade on the outer Corellian Run, increasing its wealth and importance even further. Of course, all of this wealth went straight into the coffers of the Christopsian ruling class, which was descended from human to Parsi nobles that settled the world in 600 BBY. The planet's lower class, a mix of humans, Rhodians, and Kokoidians, were practically enslaved. Not far down the Corellian Run was the trade world Arcanis and its dependent territories, the former systems of the Arcanian Regency, which controlled most of the sector before it joined the Republic. Arcanis lay at the crossroads of the Corellian Run and the Trielis trade route, and its sector of space was fairly typical for this part of the Outer Rim. Close to the Run were the other worlds of the Arcanian Regency: the industrial planets Isor, Cadesia, and Huldamun, the agri-world New Ator, the asteroids near the gas giant Olstan, and the pleasant, mostly unspoiled planet Vash, the garden of the Regency. Not far down the Trielis, however, the influence of Arcania ended, and the influence of the Hutts began. Kamal Station, a swampy moon orbiting the gas giant Kamal, was considered the official boundary line between the two sides of the sector, and just past it lay Tatooine. Tatooine, as you really should know by now, was a mostly desolate dust ball, home to the Sand People, the Jawas, and several towns established by settlers. These towns were known across the slice as hives of scum and villainy, best avoided if possible. Tatooine was originally settled as a mining world, first by Zerka Corporation and then by the Corellian Mining Corporation, but Tatooine metal quickly proved to be worse than useless and the mines dried up. The company's sand crawlers were abandoned and taken over by Jawas, and in more modern times, Tatooine was only inhabited by moisture farmers and criminals, with the latter notably including Jabba the Hutt, who had his palace on Tatooine. Tatooine was far from the only mining world in the Arcanis sector. Others included Underwheel, Micah, Heffron, Circus 2, Cranan, the moons of Geti 4, Vaktuine, the asteroid fields of Obana, and Melnir's world. Indeed, there weren't all that many planets in the Arcanis sector that weren't mining worlds. These included Najiba, homeworld of the Najib, the smuggler's haunt Kubiye, the trade worlds Puroket and Vordio, and the Faroon worlds, a trio of Hutt throne worlds on the Trielis. There was also Geonosis, located very close to Tatooine, a barren world inhabited by the insectoid Geonosians, the infamous designers of the CIS's battle droids. The Geonosians were isolationists for most of their history, but during the Republic's final decades, the products of their droid factories began spreading throughout the galaxy, and the Geonosians began establishing new factories on nearby colony worlds. We mentioned one of them, Zadja, already. The rest are further rimward and will be discussed later. Past the Arcanis sector, the Trielis cut through the Groll and Abrian sectors. Groll sector was mostly uneventful. It contained Ostega, the site of a minor shipyard, Felicat, home of the Felicasians, Sukame, a former Trade Federation agri-world, and Pawpaw, the site of the Gank massacres in the 4800s BBY. But the Abrian sector was much more lively. It was home to hundreds of agri-worlds, including the sector capital, Abrian Major, and Yukio on the Manda Merchant Route, homeworld of the Yukians, a temperate world with a long growing season that made its fields especially productive. The Abrian sector was also home to mining worlds such as Varistad and the 7 planets of the Tal Sakar system, which were home to the Genet. 2 other worlds in this sector, both on the Manda Merchant Route, were particularly significant. One was Rishi, a lush planet inhabited by the winged Rishi, which was the starting point of the Zareka string, the only reliable route to Camino and the Rishi Maze, closest satellite galaxy. The other was Molavar, a city desert planet located at the crossroads of the Manda Merchant Route and the Trielis trade route, which was home to the Molavarans. Also located in the Abrian sector was the Cloak of the Sith, a nearby impenetrable molecular cloud that shrouded the legendary planet Rune, the only source of the valuable rune stones and the former capital of both the ancient Tong and Brotherhood of Darkness. After the Abrion sector, the Trielis trade route ran off into mostly empty space, so we're going to briefly shift back to the Corellian Run, which passed through a few more sectors before unceremoniously dumping out into wild space. The only truly significant world along this last leg of the run was Ryloth, the tidally locked homeworld of the Twi'leks, the second most common sentient species in the galaxy. Ryloth had an extremely harsh climate, making life for the Twi'leks extremely hard. It was a poor world, but it did have some political significance, however, as the Twi'leks were spread far across the galaxy, and Ryloth was a major producer of real spice, which gave it some degree of trade despite its remote location. In that regard, it certainly helped that it was located on the Corellian Run. Apart from Ryloth though, there was next to nothing on this most distant leg of the run. The only other notable worlds were Rhea, home of the Rians, and Smuggler's Run, an asteroid field past Ryloth that was a notorious pirate haunt. Between the Trielis and Run was a large chunk of Outer Rim sectors that all contained very little of note. The most important planets in this region were all remote droid manufacturing worlds settled by the Geonosians and Techno Union, which they used to build huge armies of battle droids far from the watchful eyes of Republic regulators. These included the rocky, mineral-rich planet Hypori, the young world Zorn, the Mun-owned industrial colony Vlemoth Port, and the worlds of the Siskine system, which contained the factory worlds Siskine and Olonet, and several satellite factories above the gas giant Kea. Most of these planets were also home to extensive mines, but they also drew in resources from nearby mining worlds, including Shinbone Xkaga, Quiberon 5, and Shola. The Republic maintained an important production world in this remote region too, Rathana, the frigid headquarters of Rathana Heavy Engineering, a Kuat drive yard subsidiary that designed the ATTE and other vehicles for the Grand Army of the Republic. Other notable worlds out here included Ord Klina, an old Republic military base, Morgania, homeworld of the Morganians, Zilzash, a minor agri-world, Pizob, the Gamorrean Soul Colony, Kowak, the rainforested home of the incessantly annoying Kowakian monkey lizards, and the minor trade world Arduba. Sentient species in this region included the Fuzums of Dandalo, the Tamuzan of the double-ringed eponymous planet, the Nish of Nishir, the theocratic Stellan of Stellan, the Felinians of Zoma 5, and the imperialistic Dorunde of the planet Dorunde. The Trialis trade route cut through the northeast fringe of this region, passing through the Quiberon and Tamuz sectors on its way to the periphery of Hutt Space. Along the way, it passed a few notable worlds, particularly Gamor, the swampy homeworld of the brutish Gamorreans, and Cyverus, an asteroid shadowport at the junction between the Trialis and Holliston Run. Close to Cyverus was the minor trade world Unagrin, the tiny mining world Dodds, and Altor 14, the homeworld of the Avogui and the Newit. Past Cyverus, the Trialis plunged into the farthest reaches of the Outer Rim, passing Dubrava, home of the Dubravans, and Barab 1, the twilight homeworld of the fearsome reptilian Barabels. Barab 1 orbited a red dwarf, and its native Barabels had to be tough to survive its harsh surface conditions. It was close to Ord Lonesome, a Pius Dea-era Republic garrison world, and the Regulan system, which contained a pair of mining worlds inhabited by Octusai. The Trialis intersected with the Shag Pobol at Teth, a purplish world long used by the Hutts as a remote getaway, which was the site of a minor battle during the Clone Wars. Teth lay at the heart of a small region of backwater systems, including Rin, home of the Tintina, Glottal, home of the Glottal Thibs, the remote mining planet Beriz, and Clytonia, home of the Clytonians. Not far north of Teth was the Kessel sector, home to one of the galaxy's most infamous spice mines. The Kessel sector was full of navigational hazards, the largest of which were the Maw Nebulae and Ashteris Cloud, which took up most of the sector. The main routes through the nebulae were the Trialis and the Pabol Slaheron, which intersected at Formos, a trade world regularly used for smuggling. Formos was one of many spice distribution hubs in the sector. Others included Druelkin, Renok, Obadiah, Injapan, Mandrine, and the Lexus systems. There are a few non-spice related colony worlds in the sector, notably Randa, Prishella 3, and Little Kessel, but they were outnumbered by the distributors. The only important one was Honagar, home to the Nogri, a species renowned for their cunning warriors. Honagar used to be a backwater jungle world left alone by the galaxy, but after a battle during the Clone Wars, the planet's entire ecology was poisoned, rendering nearly all of the planet uninhabitable and destroying the Nogri's way of life. Naturally, the heart of the Kessel sector was Kessel itself. Located deep in the Maw Nebulae, Kessel was a misshapen, airless planet dotted with spice mines which tunneled through its crust looking for glitterstim, the most potent variety of spice which was only found in Kessel. The spice mines of Kessel were a notoriously horrific place. The workers were either slaves or treated little better, the mines were pitch black, and energy spiders plagued the lower tunnels. Kessel was also very hard to reach. There were two routes which had access to it: the Kessel Trade Corridor, which was the safe and legitimate route, and the Kessel Run, a smuggler's route that cut through the Maw Nebulae. On the way, the Kessel Run passed by the Pit, a narrow region packed with asteroids and the infamous black hole cluster known as the Maw. Beyond the Kessel sector was the last sector we're going to be discussing today, the Caleron sector. For such an obscure region of space, this sector was surprisingly lively, containing the homeworlds of quite a few species. The Krubaz of Kobindi and the Polowik of Lowik were the most well known. The Krubaz were a species of trunked insectivores that commonly acted as spies and had poor relations with most insectoid species, while the Palowik were an unusual amphibious species known for their singers, the most famous of whom was Sai Snoodles. Kobindi was an extremely arid world that orbited a giant blue star, where the Krubaz cultivated insects to feast on, while Lowik was a world of seas, rainforests, and salt marshes, where the Palowik lived as simple fisherfolk. Other species in the sector included the spider-like 6-6 of Sisk, the Geronites of Geran, and the Lyra of Eftal. Also in the Caleron sector was the agri-world Freelik, the mining world Serigar, the Old Hutt staging ground Davanis, and Norval II, graveyard of the Mandalorian protectors. Prior to the Clone Wars, this part of the Outer Rim lay almost entirely outside of Republic jurisdiction, with only a handful of sectors here having Senate representation. Instead, this whole region, with the notable exceptions of the Abrion, Groll, and Savarine sectors, was under Hutt control. In some places, like Tatooine, Hutt rule was direct. In other places, it was mostly a formality, and in practice, most of the region was lawless. But the outbreak of the Clone Wars saw both the Republic and Confederacy push into Hutt territory in the southern Outer Rim, which the Republic branded the Siskiyne Theater. The Separatists had scattered patches of territory throughout the Hutt-run sectors. The Ferra, Hunovers, and Saveda sectors were all Separatist-controlled, as was most of the Abrian sector and parts of the Arcanis, Groll, Dalchon, Golis, Bitrose, and Instrop sectors. Of these territories, only the Abrian sector was a formal member of the Confederacy, but the other sectors were home to a scattering of Separatist strongholds. There was Geonosis, obviously, as well as Hypori, Olenet, Siskiyne, Kaer, Zorn, and Zadja. All of these strongholds were major droid manufacturers, and a large chunk of the CIS droid army was produced here in the Siskiyne Theater. The Republic, meanwhile, advanced in the region to combat the Separatist presence, and in doing so, it established itself in a part of space where Republic authority had previously been non-existent. The region was split between the 13th and 14th Sector armies. The 13th Sector army patrolled the Savarine and Abrion sectors, as well as the Hutt-dominated Outer Trialis, while the 14th Sector army, Redtail's command, managed most of the Siskiyne Theater from its headquarters on Ryloth. Apart from Ryloth, Redtail's command had strongholds on Frigid Rothana, Juma 9, and on the mining world Exkarga. On the other end of the theater, Iron Land's command set up listening posts on Pastil and the moon of Rishi, both meant to guard the Zoreka String, the route to Camino. The Outer Trialis trade routes saw the occasional battle, most notably the battles of Teth, Nadim, and Honagar, but it was quiet for the most part, as there was little of value back there. The Siskiyne Theater, meanwhile, was a hotspot all throughout the Clone Wars. The war began here with the Battle of Geonosis, which saw the Republic capture the Separatists' primary droid factories. But for most of the early war, the Separatists were on the offensive in the Siskiyne Theater. In the war's first year, they retook Geonosis, conquered Christosis on the Corellian Run, and even captured Ryloth, the 14th Army's headquarters. Rhodia even briefly flirted with seceding to receive aid from the Trade Federation, and the Republic's early war assault on Hypori ended in complete disaster. But the Republic eventually reversed most of these losses. Christosis was retaken, and after a months-long occupation, so was Ryloth. Geonosis was captured again, albeit at high cost, and the Geonosian factory on Zadja was destroyed. Throughout the second year of the war, the Republic fought a constant back-and-forth war in the region, particularly in the Groll sector, which was littered with wrecked battle droids by the war's end. But by the start of the Outer Rim sieges, the Republic had finally succeeded in containing Separatist forces in the Siskiyne Theater. In the last months of the war, the Republic began to besiege the Confederacy's factory worlds in the region. Major battles of the Outer Rim sieges were fought here at Zorn, Ryloth, Siskiyne, and Telenorweg, ultimately crippling the droid army's manufacturing capabilities. That brings us to the end of our tour of the slice. We hope you've enjoyed this exhaustively thorough look at one of the Star Wars galaxy's most important regions. But what do you think? Do you like these sorts of videos? Which of the planets or peoples of the slice do you find most interesting? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.